There is a particular kind of silence that arrives just before catastrophe. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of held breath, of something vast and terrible gathering itself before it moves. On the morning of the 1st of April, 1945, more than 60,000 American soldiers and Marines waded ashore on a small island in the Pacific and found exactly that silence. No shells, no machine guns, no screaming, just wind, and the sound of boots on sand, and a stillness so complete it felt like a gift. It was not a gift. The Japanese were waiting. They had been waiting for weeks, buried deep inside limestone hills, folded into cave systems that ran like the roots of an ancient tree beneath the island's skin. General Mitsuru Ushijima's army had simply let the Americans come. Let them land. Let them celebrate. Let them believe, even for a few days, that this might be easy, that the Pacific War's last great island battle might be the one that finally broke Japan's will to resist, without breaking too many American bones in the process. They were wrong about that too. What followed was 82 days of some of the most brutal, grinding, intimate combat the American military had ever experienced. Not the sweeping naval victories of Midway, not the island-hopping campaigns where speed and air power could leapfrog Japanese strength. This was something older and uglier. Men fighting for single ridgelines. Men dying for hills with names like Sugarloaf. Names that sound almost quaint until you understand that those hills changed hands again and again, soaked in blood each time, and that the men who finally held them were often not the men who had started the assault. The terrain swallowed soldiers whole. The caves gave nothing back. And yet, and this is the part that tends to get buried beneath the casualty figures, Japan lost. Not despite the strength of her defenses. Not despite the ingenuity of her commanders, or the courage of her soldiers, or the psychological weight of her kamikaze pilots screaming down out of the sky onto American destroyers in one of the most terrifying air campaigns of the entire war. Japan lost because of choices, because of arguments between generals, because of a military culture that valued death over withdrawal and honor over supply lines. Because a defender with a brilliant plan was overruled by a commander who could not bear to simply wait. That is the story we are going to tell tonight. Okinawa is not a story most people outside of military history circles know in full. They know pieces of it, perhaps. They know Hacksaw Ridge, the extraordinary story of a conscientious objector who carried dozens of wounded men off a bluff that seemed designed to kill everyone who approached it. They might know the kamikazes, those images of aircraft transformed into weapons by the simple, devastating calculation that the pilot was more expendable than the mission. They might know, in a general way, that the battle was ferocious, that it shaped American thinking about the planned invasion of mainland Japan, and that the casualty projections coming out of Okinawa were part of what made the atomic bomb decision feel, to those who made it, like a terrible arithmetic rather than a choice. But the full story, the story of why Japan lost, specifically, and what that loss reveals about the intersection of strategy, culture, command, and chance, that story deserves more than a footnote. It deserves the kind of slow, careful attention you give to something that matters. And if you are here, watching this, settling in for the night, that is exactly the kind of attention you are prepared to give. So let's take it from the beginning. Okinawa sat at the end of a long chain of American advances across the Pacific. By the spring of 1945, the strategic logic was almost geometric in its clarity. The Americans needed a staging point close enough to Japan's home islands to support the kind of invasion force that would be required to end the war. Okinawa, roughly 540 kilometers from the southern tip of Kyushu, was that point. It had airfields, it had harbors, it had enough landmass to absorb the equipment, the fuel, the ammunition, and the men that an invasion of Honshu would demand. The Americans called their operation Iceberg, and the name fit. What you saw on the surface, the beaches, the fields, the modest towns, was only the smallest part of what was actually there. What was actually there was an island, that had been transformed, quietly and meticulously, into a fortress. General Ushijima and his staff had studied the failures at Iwo Jima, at Peleliu, at every island where Japanese forces had tried to stop Americans at the waterline and been ground into the sand. They had drawn a different conclusion. Do not fight on the beaches. Let the Americans land. Let them feel the warmth of false success. And then, when they push south, when they come looking for what they assume will be a retreating, demoralized enemy, show them what you have actually built. What they had built was extraordinary. Miles of interconnected tunnels, artillery positions cut into rock so deeply that naval bombardment could not reach them, machine gun nests positioned to cover every approach, every ridge, every natural avenue of advance. The southern half of the island had been turned into a killing ground, and the men inside it were prepared to die there, in the most literal sense of the phrase. There were also, crucially, approximately 120,000 civilians still on the island, people who had not been evacuated, people who would be caught between two armies and the weight of propaganda that told them the Americans would be worse than anything the battle itself could produce. Their presence adds a dimension to this story that no honest account can avoid, a moral weight that sits alongside the military history and refuses to be separated from it. Tonight, across the chapters ahead, we are going to walk through all of it. The American Armada, the Japanese fortress, the landings that felt like a miracle and the ambush that ended that feeling within days, the artillery duels, the cave-by-cave clearances, the kamikaze waves that turned the waters off Okinawa into something out of a nightmare, the command crisis at the heart of Japanese headquarters, where two men with two entirely different visions of how to die argued about how many Americans they could kill before the end came. And the end itself, the withdrawal, the collapse, the final days in a shrinking pocket of resistance on the Kian Peninsula, where an army that had once held an entire island found itself crowded into a few square kilometers, running out of everything and still fighting. The question this documentary asks is simple, even if the answer is not, why did Japan lose? Not just in the sense of who had more guns, more ships, more men, but in the deeper sense, in the sense of decisions made under pressure, of strategies chosen or rejected, of a military culture that shaped the battlefield as surely as any fortification. If you are ready to find out, settle in. This is the Battle of Okinawa, and this time we are going to understand it, not just watch it happen. There is an island in the East China Sea that sits like a drawn breath between two certainties. It is long and narrow, roughly 110 kilometers from its northern tip to its southern edge, shaped less like a fortress and more like an afterthought of geology, a ribbon of limestone and coral that the ocean has been slowly consuming for 10,000 years. Its hills are not dramatic. Its valleys are not wide. Yet by the spring of 1945, this modest strip of rock and red clay had become the most strategically consequential piece of ground in the entire Pacific. Whoever held Okinawa held the key to Japan's front door, and both sides understood, with absolute clarity, what that meant. The Americans had been moving across the Pacific for nearly 4 years by that point, island by island, atoll by atoll, closing the distance to the Japanese home islands in increments that seemed both achingly slow and historically breathtaking. Each campaign had been a lesson written in blood. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and each lesson had sharpened American understanding of what Japanese defensive warfare looked like at its most disciplined. But Okinawa was different from anything that had come before it. It was not a remote coral speck. It was not an anonymous jungle ridge. It was a populated island with a history, a culture, and a people who were neither fully Japanese nor fully anything else, a place that had been absorbed into the Japanese Empire only decades earlier and had never quite forgotten what it felt like to be something separate. Okinawa had been the heart of the Ryukyu Kingdom for centuries, a seafaring trading civilization that occupied a middle space between China and Japan both geographically and culturally. The Okinawan language was related to Japanese, but distinct enough that a mainlander arriving on the island would struggle to follow a conversation. The customs were different. The architecture was different. Even the food reflected a culture that had spent centuries looking outward across the sea, rather than inward toward Tokyo. When Japan formally annexed the Ryukyu chain in the late 19th century, the incorporation was administrative before it was cultural, and for many Okinawans, the decades that followed were marked by a persistent second-class status within an empire that celebrated them in propaganda, but regarded them with quiet condescension in practice. By 1945, the Japanese military had been present on Okinawa in strength for several years, and the relationship between the occupying garrison and the local population was shaped by that same ambivalence. Okinawans were Japanese citizens in the eyes of the law, expected to serve, to sacrifice, to endure. But they were not quite trusted in the way that mainland soldiers trusted one another. This tension, between the strategic value Japan placed on the island and the cultural distance it maintained from its people, would run like a fault line beneath every decision made in the months leading up to the American assault, with consequences that no planning map could have predicted. American military planners, working from their bases in the Philippines and from command centers scattered across the Western Pacific, looked at Okinawa and saw something precise and calculable. The island's position placed it roughly 550 kilometers from the southernmost point of Kyushu, the southernmost of Japan's main home islands. That distance was close enough for land-based fighter aircraft to provide cover over the Japanese coast, close enough for B-29 bombers to operate with greater flexibility, and close enough for a massive invasion fleet to stage, resupply, and launch from. Without Okinawa, an invasion of Honshu would require operating at the outer edge of logistical possibility. With it, the invasion became something plannable, something executable. The island was not a prize in itself. It was the last door that needed to be forced open before the final chapter could begin. The operation that American planners developed was designated Iceberg, a name that carried its own quiet irony, something enormous concealed beneath an apparently manageable surface. The scale of what was being assembled in the months before the assault was genuinely staggering. Planners called for more than 1,500 ships. They called for amphibious forces exceeding 180,000 men in the initial assault wave. They called for enough ammunition, food, fuel, and medical supplies to sustain a campaign of potentially months on a contested island, with no existing infrastructure capable of supporting an army of that size. The Americans had done this before, but never quite like this, and the men responsible for translating plans into reality understood that Okinawa represented a threshold beyond which the war would either accelerate toward conclusion or settle into a form of violence that defied easy description. In Tokyo and in the command structures that radiated outward from it, the approaching assault on Okinawa generated a debate that was both strategic and deeply uncomfortable. There were those in Japanese high command who recognized, with clear eyes, that Okinawa could not be held indefinitely. The naval superiority that Japan had once wielded was gone. The air forces that might have contested the skies over the island had been bled white across years of attrition. The supply lines that should have sustained a major garrison were vulnerable to American submarines that prowled every approach. Holding Okinawa against an assault of the size being prepared was not a military calculation that offered optimistic outcomes. It was, at best, a calculation about how much it would cost the Americans to take it. That calculation drove a particular and terrible logic. If Okinawa could not be held, then the question became how to make its loss as expensive as possible, how to inflict enough casualties on American forces that the prospect of invading the home islands became a political and military nightmare in Washington. This was the doctrine that shaped everything that followed. Not victory, not survival in any meaningful sense, but cost. The Japanese command on Okinawa was instructed, in essence, to make the island a machine for producing American dead, and to keep that machine running for as long as the terrain and the men defending it allowed. Into this strategic framework stepped the question of what to do with the civilian population. Approximately 120,000 Okinawans remained on the island as the American assault drew closer. Evacuation orders had been issued at various points, and some civilians had left, boarding ships that sometimes did not survive the crossing. But most had stayed because they had nowhere obvious to go, because the warnings had been vague, because the ties to land and home and the graves of ancestors were not easily severed by military decree. Japanese command faced a choice that was never openly acknowledged as a choice: use the civilian population as part of the defense, or remove them from the battle space. The former was more useful. The former was what happened. Civilians were incorporated into labor battalions, supply networks, and support roles that wove their lives directly into the military fabric of the defense. Young men were conscripted into auxiliary units. Women and older residents dug positions, carried supplies, and worked in field hospitals. The civilian population did not simply share the island with the garrison, they became functionally inseparable from it, their fates bound to the outcome of a battle they had not chosen and had not been fully informed about. Japanese military authorities maintained a careful control over what Okinawan civilians were told about the Americans, and what they were told reflected the requirements of military discipline rather than anything approaching the truth. What strikes any observer, looking back across nearly 80 years, is the degree to which Okinawa occupied entirely different imaginative spaces for the two forces converging upon it. For American planners, it was a coordinate, a stepping stone, a problem to be solved with sufficient application of firepower and logistics. For Japanese commanders, it was a place to be consumed rather than defended, sacrificed slowly to produce the attrition that might buy time. For the Okinawan people themselves, it was simply home, a home that two distant powers had decided, without consulting its inhabitants, would serve as the site of one of the most destructive battles of the entire 20th century. That asymmetry between the island's strategic abstraction for those who planned its destruction and its lived reality for those who would die on it is the unspoken premise of everything that follows. It is the distance between a map coordinate and a village road, between a casualty estimate and a name, between a campaign that was won and a people who were simply there when it happened. Somewhere in the Western Pacific, in the early months of 1945, the ocean itself began to change. Sailors standing watch on distant vessels reported it first. Not a sound, not a signal, but a feeling. The water around them was filling up. Ships appeared on every horizon, then more ships behind those, until the sea between the Marianas and the Ryukyu Islands became something that defied easy description. It was not a fleet in any conventional sense. It was a migration. A slow, deliberate convergence of American industrial will, pointed like a spear at a single island chain that most people back home could not yet find on a map. Operation Iceberg was the name American planners had given to the assault on Okinawa, and from the moment the name was chosen, the scale of the undertaking shaped everything around it. The operation would require more than 1,500 ships, warships, transports, landing craft, support vessels, hospital ships, tankers, and tenders, drawn from across the Pacific theater and coordinated into a single vast mechanism. Nothing like it had been attempted before, not in the Pacific, not anywhere. The logistical challenge alone was staggering. Fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, replacement parts, and the men themselves had to be marshaled, loaded, timed, and moved across thousands of kilometers of open ocean, with enough precision to land tens of thousands of troops on a specific beach on a specific morning. The men responsible for making that happen worked through months of late nights and revised manifests, building an operation that was less like a military campaign and more like the largest moving operation in human history. The planning had begun well before the ships ever moved. American strategists had identified Okinawa as the essential final step before any invasion of the Japanese home islands could be contemplated. The island sat roughly 550 kilometers southwest of Kyushu, close enough to bring land-based aircraft within range of the Japanese mainland. Its natural harbor at Naha and its airfields, once captured and expanded, would give American commanders the forward base they needed to project force directly into the heart of the enemy's remaining territory. Without Okinawa, the final campaign against Japan would be stretched impossibly thin. With it, the Americans would hold a knife at Japan's throat. The decision to take it was never seriously in doubt. The question was always how and at what cost. Intelligence gathering began in earnest during the final weeks of 1944 and accelerated through the opening months of 1945. American submarines prowled the waters surrounding the Ryukyus, mapping currents and charting shallow approaches. Carrier-based aircraft flew photographic reconnaissance missions over the island at altitudes designed to frustrate ground fire, returning with images that analysts pored over in quiet rooms far from the front. What they saw told a complicated story. The northern portion of Okinawa appeared lightly defended, its rugged terrain sparsely occupied. The southern end was something else entirely. The photographs showed disturbed earth and suspicious shadows, the unmistakable signatures of excavation and construction on a significant scale. The Japanese were building something in the south. American analysts noted it carefully, filed their assessments, and passed them up the chain of command. What those assessments could not fully capture was the depth and ingenuity of what General Ushijima's engineers had accomplished beneath the surface. American photographic intelligence was excellent at finding what showed above ground, but the defensive network taking shape on Okinawa was designed to hide. Cave mouths were camouflaged, spoil from digging was scattered, and movement above ground was restricted to darkness wherever possible. The analysts saw enough to know that a serious defensive system was under construction. They could not know how serious. They graded their confidence intervals honestly and moved on to the next problem, because there was always a next problem, and the invasion schedule was not going to wait. Tokyo, for its part, was watching. Japanese signals intelligence and the simple arithmetic of geography told the Imperial General Headquarters what was coming. The scale of American movement in the Central Pacific was impossible to conceal entirely, and the volume of American radio traffic, even encrypted, told experienced listeners that something enormous was being organized. The question in Tokyo was not whether an attack on the Ryukyus was coming, but when, and with precisely how much force. Japanese planners fed what they knew to Ushijima and his staff on Okinawa, supplemented by aerial reconnaissance that became increasingly costly as American fighter cover over the assembling fleet grew denser with each passing week. By the time the invasion was clearly imminent, Japanese planners had formed a reasonably accurate picture of American intentions, if not of the precise landing sites. Their response was already baked into the stone and earth of the southern island. They had prepared what they could. They would wait. The American pre-invasion bombardment began weeks before the first soldier set foot on a beach. Naval gunfire from battleships, cruisers, and destroyers churned the shorelines and worked systematically across known and suspected Japanese positions. Carrier aircraft struck airfields, road junctions, supply depots, and any position that showed signs of enemy activity. The tempo of these strikes increased as the invasion date approached, designed not only to destroy Japanese capability, but to suppress the defenders, force them underground, and deny them the freedom to reposition or reinforce. American naval officers watching the smoke rising from Okinawa's southern hills were satisfied with what they saw. The island appeared to be absorbing punishment, with the convincing passivity of a target being neutralized. The bombardment was doing its work. It was doing less work than it appeared to be doing. Ushijima's defensive network had been conceived precisely to survive exactly this kind of preparation. Troops were ordered into deep cover when bombardment began, sheltering in caves and tunnels that naval gunfire could not reach without a direct hit on the entrance. Artillery pieces were positioned in reverse slope defilades or concealed beneath limestone overhangs. Machine gun nests were cut into hillsides at angles that made them invisible from the air and nearly invulnerable to anything short of a ground assault with direct fire. The Japanese defenders endured the weeks of bombardment with a disciplined patience that American planners, watching from ships offshore, had no way of measuring accurately. When the guns finally fell silent and the landing craft began their runs to the beach, the men in those caves would be battered, shell-shocked, and deafened, but they would be alive, and their weapons would be loaded. The men assembling for the invasion were a cross-section of American military power at the peak of its wartime development. Marine and Army divisions that had fought at Guadalcanal, Peleliu, Leyte, and Iwo Jima brought with them a combat experience that was hard and specific. They had learned, in blood, how to clear caves and how to hold ground under fire. They had also learned to distrust initial impressions on Japanese-defended islands. A beach that looked quiet was not necessarily a beach that was safe. A position that appeared destroyed from the air might be fully manned underground. These men carried their earned caution onto the transports and into the landing craft, and it would serve them better than any briefing. The supporting arms arrayed for Operation Iceberg represented an accumulation of technical and tactical learning that the American military had been building since the dark early days of the Pacific War. Naval gunfire coordination had grown sophisticated, with shore-fire control parties trained to call in rapid adjustments against specific targets. Close air support doctrine had evolved through painful trial and error into something genuinely effective, with aircraft on station and airborne controllers in communication with ground units in real time. Artillery, both Marine and Army, had developed a depth of technique in counter-battery work, time on target fire, and infantry support that made American ground operations increasingly lethal to defenders who attempted to hold exposed positions. The Japanese had built their defenses partly in response to these advantages, choosing concealment and depth over surface firepower precisely because they understood they could not match American technology in an open exchange. The battle that was coming would pit American firepower against Japanese engineering, and neither side had yet fully reckoned with the other's strengths. As the fleet gathered and the final planning cables flew between Guam, Pearl Harbor, and the vessels at sea, the ordinary men of that enormous armada went about their routines with the particular mix of boredom and dread that precedes any large operation. Mess lines, equipment checks, briefings that repeated what everyone already knew, and letters home that said less than they meant. The island was visible from some ships, a low green shape on the southwestern horizon, unremarkable at distance, giving nothing away. The men who studied it through binoculars saw hills and clouds and a coastline. They could not see what was waiting inside the hills, and the reconnaissance photographs, for all their precision, could not fully show them either. That was the gap between intelligence and knowledge, between what could be observed and what could be understood. It was a gap that would cost a great many of those men their lives. What is clear, looking at the full record of those preparatory weeks, is that the American build-up for Operation Iceberg was a genuine military achievement, organized on a scale that had no precedent. The intelligence work was thorough and honest about its limits. The bombardment was intense and delivered with professional competence. The logistics were managed with a precision that kept over 1,500 ships in coordination across a vast expanse of open ocean. And none of it resolved the central problem that was waiting in the limestone hills of southern Okinawa, where tens of thousands of soldiers who had been given no option except resistance had turned the earth into a weapon. The storm was gathering, and it was heading for a fortress that had been waiting for it all along. Okinawa did not surrender its secrets easily. The island's southern terrain was a geologist's curiosity and a soldier's nightmare. Ridges of ancient coral limestone riddled with natural caves, gullies that swallowed entire platoons from sight, and hillsides that could conceal entire armies without a single deliberate fortification. The Japanese garrison looked at this landscape and saw something American planners had not yet understood. Not an obstacle to be overcome, but a weapon to be loaded. General Mitsuru Ushijima, commanding the 32nd Army, was a patient man with a steady temperament, the kind of officer who listened before he spoke and measured before he cut. He had inherited a garrison that had already been partially stripped, Some of his best divisions redirected to the Philippines and Formosa under pressure from higher command. What remained was fewer men than he had wanted, less artillery than he had planned for, and a home island government watching over his shoulder. He responded not with desperation, but with arithmetic. If numbers were against him, then ground would have to do the work that soldiers could not. Beside him was Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, the 32nd Army's senior operations officer and the man who would become the intellectual architect of the entire defensive plan. Where Ushijima carried command with composure, Yahara carried it with precision. He was a strategic mind of uncommon clarity, calculating, unsentimental, deeply skeptical of glory-seeking that wasted men on gestures. Yahara had studied the early American island campaigns closely, watching how Japanese forces had repeatedly sacrificed themselves in banzai charges and counterattacks that killed many but accomplished little beyond accelerating defeat. He drew one central conclusion from those disasters. The Americans could be bled, but not by charging into their firepower. They had to be invited into yours. The only way to extract maximum cost from a superior enemy was to make them come to you, on ground you had prepared, into positions they could not see, against defenders they could not reach with shells alone. It was a cold logic, and Yahara believed it completely. The plan they developed together was called the Shuri Defense, named for the ancient castle that dominated the high ground at the island's center. The concept was deceptively simple. Abandon the beaches to the Americans, draw them south, and destroy them in depth. But the execution required months of labor on a scale that strained every available resource. Tens of thousands of soldiers and Okinawan conscripts were put to work, not building walls, but burrowing into the earth itself. The natural cave systems that already honeycombed the southern limestone ridges were enlarged, reinforced, and interconnected into something approaching an underground city. New tunnels were carved where natural ones did not exist, shored with timber and fitted with ventilation shafts, ammunition stores, medical stations, and communications lines. A defender inside these systems could disappear from one firing position and emerge from another 50 meters away without ever breaking surface, leaving the attacking infantry swinging at smoke. The outer layer of the defense was built in interlocking rings. No single position was meant to stand alone. Every strong point was arranged so that when an attacker came for one, he would be taken under fire from at least two others he could not see. Machine gun nests were positioned to cover the approaches to mortar pits. Mortar pits were positioned to cover the ground in front of artillery emplacements. Artillery emplacements were dug so deeply into reverse slopes that direct fire from American naval guns could pound the crest of a ridge for hours without touching the barrel of a single Japanese gun on the other side. It was a system that assumed overwhelming American firepower from the beginning and designed itself around surviving it. Every position was a problem that the Americans would have to solve separately, at close range, under fire from positions they had not yet located. The terrain itself became an active collaborator. Okinawa's central and southern zones were a mosaic of features the Americans would later name after things familiar to them: Sugarloaf, Conical, Half Moon, Chocolate Drop, Hacksaw Ridge. But these were not merely hills. Each one was a prepared defensive complex embedded into the larger grid, with tunnels running to neighboring high points, with pre-registered artillery concentrations mapped out for every likely American approach. The Japanese engineers had used the months before the invasion to walk every piece of ground they intended to defend, calculate fields of fire, identify dead ground the Americans would naturally use for cover, and position weapons specifically to cover that dead ground. An American soldier taking what appeared to be shelter in a fold of earth might find that the fold had been anticipated and was already registered by a mortar crew 500 meters away. Resources, however, were never equal to ambition. The Japanese were fighting on the far end of supply lines already stretched to breaking by American submarine warfare and air dominance over the sea lanes. Concrete was limited, so coral rubble was packed into timber frames to reinforce tunnel walls. Steel was scarce, so wood and stone substituted where metal should have been. Artillery ammunition was carefully rationed, with batteries instructed not to fire freely but to conserve rounds for moments of maximum effect. This austerity shaped the defense in important ways. It reinforced Yahara's preference for conservation over aggression, for holding fire until an American unit had committed itself so deeply that rounds could not be wasted. The garrison could not fight a generous war. Every shell had to account for itself. The disagreements began early. Not every officer inside the 32nd Army agreed with Yahara's vision of passive attrition. A contingent within the command believed that allowing the Americans to land unopposed and consolidate was a form of moral failure, a passive acceptance of defeat dressed up in the language of strategy. These voices pushed for aggressive defense of the beaches, for meeting the Americans at the water's edge with everything available. They had cultural weight behind them, the idea that a Japanese soldier did not yield ground without a fight, that withdrawal was shameful regardless of tactical merit. Yahara fought these arguments at every staff meeting, patiently and sometimes coldly, laying out the mathematics of what beach defense against American naval gunfire would mean. He had seen those numbers play out on other islands. He had no interest in repeating them on Okinawa. Ushijima mediated. He was not a man who crushed dissent with rank, but he was a man who ultimately decided, and his decisions consistently favored Yahara's framework over the impulse toward aggressive action. The southern defensive line would be the main effort. The beaches would be left to the Americans. The garrison would wait in its stone and earth, rationing its strength, bleeding the attackers slowly across terrain chosen for maximum cost extraction. There was a strange confidence in this plan, not the confidence of men who expected to win, but the confidence of men who had decided exactly how they intended to lose, and intended to make the price of their defeat as severe as possible. They were not building a defense. They were building a machine for killing Americans, one that would run until it was physically dismantled piece by piece. The tunnel networks, when complete, were extraordinary feats of engineering under constraint. Some systems ran for hundreds of meters through solid limestone, with multiple entrances concealed in ravines, behind boulders, beneath the rubble of old structures. American infantrymen would later describe the sensation of clearing a position, taking a pillbox, destroying a machine gun nest, only to have fire open on them from behind, from a position that appeared to have been empty only minutes before. The defenders had simply retreated underground and moved laterally to emerge elsewhere. It created a combat experience unlike anything American troops had encountered in previous Pacific campaigns. You could not simply advance through these positions. You had to seal them, one by one, with flame and explosive, and the cost of sealing each one was paid in American dead. The civilian population of Okinawa existed at the edges of all this preparation, largely excluded from its true intent. Many were directed into labor details, moving supplies and digging fortifications, contributing their work to a defensive plan that Japanese military authorities had not fully explained to them. The geography of the defense, concentrated in the southern zones where most of the civilian population lived, ensured that when the battle arrived, it would arrive in the places where people had their homes, their farms, their family burial vaults. The tunnels that sheltered Japanese soldiers would also draw civilians, seeking protection from American bombardment, sometimes welcomed and sometimes driven out at gunpoint, depending on the military's changing calculus of need. The stone fortress had been built with human hands, on human ground, through human suffering, and it had not been built with those human survival particularly in mind. What Ushijima and Yahara had created by the time spring came to the Pacific was something the Americans had not yet encountered in quite this form. Not a garrison defending a position, but a garrison that had redesigned its entire environment as a weapon. The ridgelines of southern Okinawa were not natural obstacles with soldiers behind them. They were man-shaped killing machines, grown from the island's own bones, calibrated for the specific purpose of destroying the army that was coming. American firepower could flatten forests and pulverize cliffs, but it could not easily reach men 2 stories below the surface. in chambers carved from solid rock. The planners in Pearl Harbor and Washington had studied the island. They had counted the defenders. They had estimated the timeline. Most of those estimates would prove to be wrong in ways that nobody in the American command had quite prepared for, because what they were about to encounter was not merely resistance. It was an island that had been turned, deliberately and methodically, into a trap. Okinawa was not Japan, not entirely, not in the way Tokyo understood the word. The island had its own language, its own music, its own way of marking the passage of seasons and the grief of the dead. For centuries it had existed as the Ryukyu Kingdom, a sovereign trading culture perched between empires, bending to China, then to the Satsuma clan of southern Japan, then finally absorbed wholesale into the modern Japanese state in the 1870s. By 1945, 70 years of administrative assimilation had not erased that difference. Okinawans paid Japanese taxes, served in Japanese uniforms, and recited Japanese oaths. But in the villages of the southern hills, grandmothers still whispered prayers in the old tongue, and the island remembered itself as something apart. That distinction would matter enormously in the months ahead, though not in any way that brought comfort. When the Imperial Japanese Army moved onto the island in earnest, it moved with the casual authority of an occupying power dealing with a subject population, not a liberating force protecting its own people. General Ushijima's staff had strategic plans that required the island's terrain, the island's caves, and the island's labor. Whether those plans required the island's people was a question the military answered with calculation rather than care. Evacuation orders had been issued, formally and on paper. Ships had carried some residents northward and across to the main islands in the preceding months. But the evacuation was incomplete by any honest measure, undermined by the scale of the task, the shortage of transport, the disruption of sea routes under American air and submarine pressure, and the military's own competing need for labor that civilian presence supplied. When the orders went out, the machinery to enforce them was already broken. Approximately 120,000 civilians remained on Okinawa when American forces assembled offshore. They were not a single community with a single experience, but a sprawling, fractured population. Farming families in the limestone hill country of the south, fishing villages along the coastlines, school children drafted into auxiliary labor, teachers turned into nurses, elderly men and women too infirm or too rooted to move. Some had simply refused to believe that war would arrive at their specific doorstep. Some had been told the evacuation was temporary and the army would protect them. Some had no way to leave. The island's civilian population had been drawn into the military's orbit not through a single dramatic order, but through months of gradual absorption, each new demand reasonable enough in isolation, catastrophic in aggregate. The labor demands began early and expanded without limit. Young Okinawan men were conscripted into auxiliary units called boeitai, local defense battalions that served the Imperial Army in roles too mundane or too dangerous for frontline soldiers. They carried supplies through the cave systems, they dug fortifications, they repaired roads under aircraft that were already ranging over the island. They carried ammunition and equipment across terrain that wheeled transport could barely navigate. The army needed this labor and took it freely, offering in return the vague promise of military protection and the more immediate reality of military authority over their movements, their food, and their lives. To refuse was unthinkable. To question was suspicious. The logic of total war, as the imperial military applied it, left no category for neutral bystanders. Young women were organized into nursing auxiliary units, groups of schoolgirls between the ages of roughly 15 and 19, drawn from the island's middle schools and given weeks of basic medical training before being assigned to field hospitals buried deep inside cave systems. They were told they were serving the empire. They were told this was an honor. Many of them believed it, at least at first, because they had been educated in a system that taught them to believe it. These girls bandaged wounds in near-total darkness, carried the dying through passages too narrow for stretchers, and breathed air thick with infection and gunpowder residue. They had been handed a role in a war they had not chosen and given almost no information about the actual strategic situation surrounding them, what was happening offshore, what the Americans were planning, what the actual state of Japanese defenses might be. None of this reached them in any reliable form. That silence was deliberate. The Japanese military command made a calculated decision to withhold from the civilian population any accurate account of what was coming. The propaganda they received instead was a simplified and in many ways monstrous picture. Americans were beasts. They committed atrocities against civilian populations. Surrender was not an option because capture meant rape and murder and degradation beyond endurance. Okinawan civilians, denied access to any alternative source of information and saturated for years in the language of sacrifice and imperial loyalty, absorbed this picture with the credulity of people who had no tools to challenge it. The consequences of that deliberate deception would unfold across the final weeks of the battle in ways that military planners may have calculated but could not fully control. The military's relationship with Okinawan food supplies followed the same logic of extraction. Farming communities that had spent the previous years cultivating sweet potatoes, sugar cane, and rice found their stores progressively commandeered for military use. What the army needed, the army took, offering receipts that would have been redeemable in a future that was not coming. Civilian rations tightened steadily through the months of preparation. Families that had fed themselves adequately through the preceding years of war now faced shortages as military demand consumed what the island produced. The irony was complete. The people being nominally defended were being steadily consumed by the defense. In some communities, the integration between civilian life and military infrastructure had become so thorough that the line between the two had effectively dissolved. Homes near defensive positions were evacuated and converted into ammunition stores. Cave entrances near villages were sealed to civilians and fortified for military use. Local knowledge, which paths were passable in rain, which cave systems connected underground where fresh water could be found, was extracted from the population and incorporated into defensive planning. Okinawan farmers who had walked those hills for generations became, without ceremony or consent, contributors to a military architecture designed around their own displacement. The children complicate any clean account of this period. Okinawa's schools had functioned through the years of the Pacific War with the curriculum increasingly shaped by military priorities, students spending portions of their school day on agricultural labor or civil defense drills. By the final months before the American landings, normal schooling had effectively ceased. Older students had been absorbed into auxiliary roles. Younger children remained with their families in an island now operating entirely under military authority and military tempo. They had grown up hearing of the war as a distant thing happening to Japan, something requiring sacrifice but also promising eventual triumph. Now the war had arrived at their specific location, and neither they nor their parents had been told what that actually meant for the people standing in its path. Okinawan men who served in the Boitai occupied a strange and painful position within the military hierarchy. They were needed, they were used, they were not trusted. Japanese officers from the mainland regarded them as culturally inferior, their dialect a mark of lower standing, their loyalty something to be monitored rather than assumed. Okinawan soldiers were assigned to labor and support roles far more often than to combat commands. They received less training, less equipment, and less consideration. When Japanese commanders discussed the defense of the island, the fate of the Okinawan population did not feature as a primary concern. The island and its people were terrain to be used, a resource to be burned in the process of inflicting maximum cost on the approaching enemy. What makes this period so difficult to account for cleanly is that most of the civilians caught within it were not passive. They were active, trying to survive, trying to serve what they had been told were their responsibilities, trying to hold families together inside an institution that had no particular interest in their survival. The schoolgirls in the cave hospitals were not coerced at gunpoint into their auxiliary service, at least not initially. They had been raised in a value system that made their participation feel meaningful. The farmers who surrendered their food stores did so in a context where refusal carried consequences. The men digging fortifications understood that their labor was buying something, even if what it was buying was never clearly defined. The tragedy of their position is not simply that they were used, but that the system using them had also shaped how they understood their own situation. By the time the American fleet appeared on the horizon, Okinawa's civilian population had already been transformed. They were not bystanders to a military campaign. They were embedded within it, their labor woven into its logistics, their lives staked on its outcome, their understanding of what was coming filtered entirely through the information the military had chosen to give them. The army had spent months preparing the island as a killing ground for the approaching Americans, and in doing so, had placed 120,000 civilians directly inside that ground, without their full knowledge, without their real consent, and without any serious plan for their protection. The battle had not yet begun, and already its worst victims had been positioned. The 1st of April 1945, Easter Sunday, across the gray chop of the East China Sea, the largest naval armada ever assembled in the Pacific sat waiting in the pre-dawn dark. More than 1,500 ships arranged in formations so dense that lookouts on the outer screen could barely see where the fleet ended and the horizon began. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, landing craft, hospital ships, ammunition transports, fleet oilers, every vessel with a role, every role rehearsed, every man aware that this morning would be unlike any morning before it in the Pacific War. The men waiting below decks had been told what to expect. Intelligence reports, aerial photographs, the lessons of Peleliu and Iwo Jima, all of it pointed to the same conclusion. The beaches would be defended. The water would be crossed under fire. Casualties would be heavy from the first minutes. Some units had been given loss projections that no soldier wanted to read twice. Chaplains had not slept. 0800 hours. The first wave of landing craft dropped their ramps, and the men of the 1st and 6th Marine Divisions and the 7th and 96th Army Infantry Divisions waded ashore on the Hagushi beaches, rifles raised, eyes scanning the tree line for the muzzle flashes that every instinct told them were coming. They did not come. The men kept moving up the sand, crouching behind whatever cover the beach offered, hearts hammering, waiting for the world to explode. It did not. The beach was quiet, not silent. Naval gunfire still rolled across the island like distant thunder, and the sound of aircraft filled the sky above, but quiet where it mattered most, in the space between the waterline and the first line of palm trees. Men looked at each other, then they kept walking. By mid-morning, more than 60,000 American troops had come ashore, the largest single-day landing of the entire Pacific campaign, and the cost in blood had been almost nothing. The Hagushi beaches ran roughly 8 kilometers along Okinawa's central west coast, just below the island's narrow waist, and American planners had chosen them precisely because they offered the fastest route inland toward the Yontan and Kadena airfields, 2 installations that were central to every phase of the operation that followed. Securing those airfields was not secondary to the mission. For the Army, Air Forces, and Navy planners who needed forward staging for the invasion of the Japanese home islands, those airfields were the mission. Within hours of the first wave landing, assault engineers were already moving inland past the beaches, their immediate objective not a ridgeline or a village, but a stretch of cleared ground where aircraft could land, refuel, and fly again. The speed of the advance shocked everyone, including the men making it. By mid-afternoon of that first day, American units had pushed between 2 and 3 kilometers inland without encountering anything resembling organized resistance. Yontan Airfield fell to the Marines before the sun reached its highest point, taken so quickly and with so little fighting that the Japanese mechanics servicing aircraft on the field had not had time to destroy the fuel dumps they left behind. Kadena Airfield, slightly to the south, followed within hours. Men walked across ground that every pre-invasion briefing had described as heavily defended and found it empty. Not abandoned in panic, but empty in a way that felt considered, deliberate. Personal equipment lay neatly arranged. Tools had been stowed. There were signs of recent occupation everywhere, but no defenders. The absence was more unsettling than resistance would have been. American commanders sent their reports up the chain of command and tried to make sense of what was happening. For the men on the beach, Easter Sunday had produced a peculiar kind of miracle. They were alive when the mathematics of the last several landings had suggested many of them would not be. The jokes came quickly, as they always do when men survive what they feared they would not. Some called it the April Fool's Landing, a beach assault where the anticipated slaughter had failed to materialize, where the terrible machinery of amphibious assault had swung its full weight against an opponent who was simply not there. Correspondents filed dispatches describing scenes that contrasted sharply with the carnage of the previous week's bombardment. Back aboard the command ships, senior officers studied their maps and tried to decide whether the intelligence had been wrong or whether something else entirely was happening. Something else entirely was happening. General Mitsuru Ushijima had made his calculation long before the first American boot touched Okinawan sand. His chief of staff, Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, the architect of the defensive strategy that now governed every Japanese decision on the island, had argued persuasively and successfully that defending the beaches was waste. The lessons of every prior American amphibious landing were available to study. The American Navy's gunfire support was so overwhelming, the air cover so complete, the sheer weight of steel delivered onto landing beaches so catastrophic that any force positioned at the waterline would simply be destroyed before the first hour was out. Yahara saw no point in feeding men into a killing field of American choosing. Better, he argued, to let the Americans come ashore unopposed, let them consolidate, let them feel the relief of an easy morning, and then let the ground itself become the weapon. The ground Yahara had chosen was to the south. Across the southern third of Okinawa, months of hard labor had transformed every natural feature into a defensive position. Coral ridges had been honeycombed with interconnecting tunnels. Reverse slopes concealed artillery and mortar positions registered on every approach route. Cave mouths had been shaped and angled to deflect blast while providing clear fields of fire. Bunkers sat inside bunkers. Supply caches were buried deep enough to survive anything short of a direct hit from a naval shell. The whole southern landscape had been rewired, converted from terrain into a machine designed for one purpose: to kill American soldiers in the largest numbers possible, and to keep killing them for as long as the ammunition held out. None of this was visible from the air. None of it had been visible in the aerial photographs. The Americans landing on those quiet beaches had no way of knowing what was waiting for them roughly 15 kilometers to the south. While the main American force consolidated its beachhead, and the men who had expected to die that morning ate their rations and wrote letters home, other units pushed north. The northern part of Okinawa is mountainous, heavily forested, and in 1945 was only lightly garrisoned. Japanese troops in the north fought a delaying action with small units, falling back through dense vegetation, making the Americans earn their ground without committing to the kind of set-piece defense that would have been costly on both sides. Progress was steady, measured in kilometers per day rather than the meters per day that the Southern campaign would eventually produce. American infantry patrols moved through villages that had been emptied of young men and through forests thick enough to conceal an army, which, in a limited sense, they did, though not the army the Americans feared. The Northern campaign was a chase, not a siege. The civilians still on the island watched the Americans arrive with a mixture of fear, confusion, and, in some cases, cautious relief that the bombardment had not continued at full intensity. Approximately 120,000 Okinawan civilians remained on the island, and in those first days, many of them encountered American soldiers for the first time. The encounters were often surprising to both sides. American troops had been briefed to expect a hostile population. They found instead people who were frightened but not hostile, hungry and uncertain, waiting to understand what the occupation of their island would mean for them. Japanese military authorities had worked to ensure the civilian population would not cooperate with the Americans, warning of atrocities and demanding loyalty. For many Okinawans, the gap between what they had been told and what they saw in those first days created a confusion that had no easy resolution. Not then, and not in the terrible weeks that followed. The 1st of April was also the date when American naval forces began the relentless work of establishing and sustaining a logistics chain capable of feeding a land battle that no one yet knew would last 82 days. Supply ships unloaded onto beaches that, by evening, had been organized into functioning logistics points. Ammunition, food, medical equipment, engineer stores, fuel, the infrastructure of sustained land warfare arrived in the same hours that the fighting men were pushing inland. American logistical capacity was not a background fact of the battle. It was one of the battle's decisive elements, though it would take weeks before that capacity was tested in ways that revealed how much it mattered. In the early evening light of Easter Sunday, the beach still smelled of cordite from the pre-landing bombardment, but the sounds were already changing. Less the roar of naval guns, more the grind of machinery and the voices of men doing work. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the East China Sea, American commanders counted their losses for the day and found the numbers almost impossible to believe. Against all expectation, against all historical precedent established by the island campaigns that had come before, the first day on Okinawa had cost relatively few lives. The men who had made it ashore settled into defensive positions, posted their sentries, and tried to sleep on ground that had taken almost no effort to seize. The men in the command posts studied their maps and tried to project the next phase of the battle forward, the southern push, the advance toward whatever waited beyond the narrow waist of the island. The maps showed ridges, valleys, a ruined castle complex near a town called Shuri. They showed roads and rivers and the contour lines of difficult terrain. What the maps could not show, and what no amount of aerial reconnaissance had revealed, was the full depth and sophistication of what Ushijima and Yahara had built inside that terrain. The Americans had landed. The welcome had been deceptive in its warmth. The island was waiting for them to move in the only direction the Japanese needed them to go, and when they moved south, the ground itself would answer. The 1st of April 1945 had delivered something no American commander had dared predict with full confidence. A landing so quiet it bordered on surreal. More than 60,000 men had waded ashore on the Hagushi beaches and found, in place of the murderous wall of fire they had trained and prayed against, almost nothing. A few scattered shots, a handful of positions quickly overrun, the kind of silence that, on any other day, might have felt like relief. On Okinawa, it felt like a held breath. Within hours, the beachhead was secured and the advance inland had begun. American units moved quickly, the northern and central sectors of the island offering terrain that was open enough, opposition that was thin enough, that forward progress felt almost routine. Airfields at Yonten and Kadena were seized within the first day, prizes of enormous strategic value taken at a fraction of the cost anyone had budgeted for. Commanders radioed back reports that carried an unmistakable undercurrent of bewilderment. Where was the enemy? Where was the resistance that the intelligence assessments, the weeks of aerial photography, the prisoner accounts, had all suggested was waiting? The answer was waiting, just not where anyone was looking. General Mitsuru Ushijima and his chief of staff, Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, had made a decision that ran against every instinct of conventional Japanese military doctrine. They had decided not to contest the beaches, not because they lacked the will, and not because they lacked the men. They had made the deliberate calculation that the beaches were not the place where Japan could win, or more precisely, not the place where Japan could make the Americans suffer deeply enough to matter. Yahara had studied the previous island campaigns. He had read what happened at Tarawa, at Peleliu, at Iwo Jima. He understood that a determined beach defense, without the terrain advantage, without depth, without the possibility of reinforcement or resupply, would simply accelerate Japanese destruction on American terms. So instead, He had drawn the battle lines further south, buried them into the stone and coral of the Shuri Heights, and told his soldiers to wait. The waiting required discipline of a kind that is almost impossible to maintain under the psychological pressure of watching an enemy land on your soil and walk forward unopposed. Japanese soldiers crouched in their cave systems and bunkers throughout those first April days, close enough in places to hear American vehicles moving on the roads above them. They were under strict orders. Do not fire, do not reveal positions, do not engage. For soldiers raised in a military culture that prized aggressive action and the offensive spirit, that restraint carried its own particular torment. Some disobeyed. Small engagements flared, but the command held, and the main defensive architecture remained invisible, its depth and complexity still entirely unknown to the men now walking steadily toward it. American forces divided their attention in the early days of April. One substantial thrust moved northward, into the Motobu Peninsula and the Yanbaru Highlands, where Japanese forces had stationed a smaller contingent to slow rather than stop the advance. This fighting was real, but manageable, a more familiar pattern of resistance that confirmed American expectations about what the battle was supposed to look like. Units pushed through villages and across hills, making progress, taking casualties that, while painful, were proportional to the gains achieved. The Northern Campaign felt, to many who fought it, like what they had been briefed to expect from the whole island. It was not representative. It was a deliberate illusion maintained by Japanese command at the cost of their northern garrison. The southern push was different from the beginning, though its true nature took time to reveal itself fully. Patrols probing south of the original landing zones began to encounter increasingly stiff opposition as they moved closer to the Shuri line. Contact reports described positions that did not behave like rearguard delays, positions that were reinforced, mutually supporting, built into the ground rather than placed on it. Commanders sent reports up the chain. Intelligence officers revised their estimates. But the picture still had not fully resolved, partly because the forward units had not yet pressed deep enough to trigger the full weight of what Ushijima had prepared, and partly because the early days of the campaign had conditioned a kind of cautious optimism that was difficult to abandon entirely. At higher command levels, the mood shifted between relief and unease in ways that reflected how genuinely unprecedented the situation felt. Weeks of preparatory bombardment, the largest naval assembly of the Pacific War, an operation planned down to the last supply crate, and the enemy had simply not shown up to fight on the expected terms. That scenario had not featured prominently in the planning sessions. Some officers suggested the Japanese had been more weakened by the preliminary bombardment than estimates had credited. Others were less comfortable with the quiet, reading it not as weakness but as intention. Those officers were right, but the full weight of their concern had not yet translated into a fundamental revision of the campaign's expected timeline or cost. The Japanese, meanwhile, were receiving exactly what Yahara had planned for. Every day the Americans consolidated their beachhead, expanded their supply dumps, brought more artillery ashore. The battle looked more and more like a siege of American making, one that would eventually exhaust itself against prepared stone. Yahara wanted the Americans deep in the southern terrain before the killing started. He wanted them committed, supply lines stretched across the island, their naval support positioned off the coast in waters now well mapped by Japanese artillerists and air units. The patience was not passivity. It was the slow drawing of a net, and the Americans were walking into its center with textbook efficiency, flags forward, momentum unbroken. For the ordinary soldiers of both sides, that strange early period of the campaign left its own residue. American infantrymen wrote letters home, describing a battle that seemed almost too easy, words they would later struggle to reconcile with what followed. They cleaned weapons, ate hot food where it was available, marveled at the world of terraced fields and ceramic-tiled rooftops, and tried to understand what kind of place they had come to. The civilians they encountered were mostly fearful, occasionally helpful, often simply absent, having moved southward with or ahead of the retreating Japanese military presence in the north. These encounters left American soldiers with questions about what they were fighting for and what they were fighting through, questions that the coming weeks would answer with a violence that made those early April days feel like another world entirely. Japanese soldiers in the southern positions lived in a different kind of suspension. The cave systems they occupied were remarkable feats of construction achieved under severe material constraints, tunneled through coral limestone by men using tools that barely matched the scale of what they were building. They had food, though not abundantly. They had ammunition, rationed and conserved with the knowledge that no resupply would come by sea. They had orders that made sense to their commanders and at least some of their officers, but that required an almost philosophical patience from the men in the forward positions, men who could hear the American advance coming closer each day and were told still to hold their fire, still to stay hidden, still to wait for the moment Ushijima would choose. That moment had not yet come. The net was still drawing closed. American planning documents from this period reveal the quiet accumulation of doubt. Reports noted that the southern terrain grew more complex with every kilometer, that the coral ridgelines provided natural defensive positions of unusual strength, that village areas had been extensively fortified in ways that pre-landing reconnaissance had only partially captured. There was language in those assessments about the possibility of prolonged resistance in the south, language that acknowledged what the ground was beginning to suggest. But the operational rhythm of a campaign already in motion has its own momentum, and the advance continued, methodical and largely uncontested, toward lines drawn in stone that no aerial photograph had fully revealed and no bombardment had touched. What the early days of April established, above all else, was a set of false expectations on one side and a carefully managed set of conditions on the other. American commanders expected acceleration. Japanese command had designed deceleration, a campaign built not around the hope of victory in any conventional sense, but around the extraction of the highest possible price from an enemy, with every material advantage. The patience of those first weeks was not hesitation or confusion. It was strategy, cold and deliberate, authored by men who understood they were going to lose and had decided to make losing cost as much as any battle in the Pacific had ever cost. The Americans were coming south. Ushijima's fortress was ready. The waiting was almost over. The Americans had expected a vacation island. That was not a conscious belief, not something stated aloud in briefing rooms or written in operational orders. Yet, it lived beneath the surface of American assumptions in those first days of April. The unopposed landings, the empty beaches, the way entire regiments walked ashore with rifles held loosely, lacking the coiled tension of troops expecting immediate resistance. Officers who had studied the beaches through reconnaissance photographs saw only terrain, not the calculated deception that awaited them. General Ushijima had orchestrated something more cunning than a simple beachhead defense. Rather than contest the landings where American naval gunfire and air support held absolute dominion, he had withdrawn his main force southward, deeper into the island, allowing the American tide to flow inland before the current turned against it. For the first several days, American commanders interpreted silence as weakness, the lack of artillery fire, the absence of coordinated counterattacks, the way Japanese forces seemed to dissolve before concentrated pressure. All of it suggested an enemy in disarray, an island garrison preparing to collapse like so many others before it. The American advance moved steadily south and west, regiments pushing through villages and farmland under a sun that grew steadily hotter. Wounded men spoke of the strange quiet, the way their boots crunched on roads that should have erupted with gunfire. Supply lines extended behind them. Airfields were established in the northern sectors. The machinery of American military logistics ground forward with mechanical precision, processing ammunition, rations, and reinforcements through ports and beaches. By the middle of April, roughly 2 weeks after the landings, American forward elements were pushing toward what intelligence officers called the Shuri Line, a network of Japanese defensive positions anchored on the heights overlooking the southern half of Okinawa, No one imagined what they were about to encounter. The Shuri line was not a single line, but rather a series of concentric defensive zones, each prepared with meticulous detail by engineers and artillerymen who had spent months transforming coral ridges and natural depressions into near-invulnerable fortress positions. The Japanese had excavated caves deep into the limestone ridges, creating underground command posts, ammunition magazines, and firing positions that could withstand hours of artillery bombardment. Bunkers were constructed with multiple escape routes and lateral galleries connecting different positions, preventing American troops from sealing off and eliminating single strongpoints. Artillery pieces, both howitzers and smaller caliber guns, were emplaced on reverse slopes where they could fire over the ridge crests without exposing themselves to direct observation or air attack. Machine gun nests were sited to create overlapping fields of fire across every approach route, with secondary positions prepared to defend against flanking movements. The depth of these preparations reflected months of labor and the intellectual investment of Japanese officers who understood that their only hope lay not in victory, but in making the victory so costly that Americans might lose the political will to continue. The American troops advancing toward this fortress were not prepared for what awaited them. Their training, their unit cohesion, their personal courage, all were genuine, yet nothing in their preparation adequately addressed the reality of assaulting troops who did not need to win battles, but only needed to kill Americans in sufficient numbers. The terrain itself favored defense. Okinawa's hills were not high mountains, but rather a series of broken ridges that rose sharply from flat approaches, offering Japanese defenders clear observation of American troop movements, while American units labored through approaches that provided minimal cover. Fields of fire extended for hundreds of meters in some sectors, creating killing zones that American soldiers would have to cross on foot. And when they reached the Japanese positions, they would find not hastily prepared entrenchments, but carefully engineered fortifications from which retreating seemed impossible and surrender unthinkable. On the 24th of April, the first American units made contact with the Shuri line in force. An artillery barrage, deliberately timed to catch American columns in the open, erupted across multiple sectors simultaneously. Shells fell on company command posts, on supply elements moving up the roads, on concentrations of infantry waiting to assault Japanese positions. American officers who had grown accustomed to the absence of serious fire were suddenly confronted with coordinated artillerymen's counterfire, the methodical, professional response of an enemy force that had known the Americans were coming and had spent weeks planning the reception. Wounded men filled medical tents. Supply officers rerouted vehicles around fresh shell craters. Intelligence officers studied maps, trying to understand the layout of Japanese positions from the pattern of incoming fire. The quiet was broken. Ushijima's ambush had triggered. The initial American response followed a predictable pattern. American artillery units, vastly superior in numbers and quality to their Japanese counterparts, immediately responded to the enemy fire by launching their own barrages against the detected enemy gun positions. American aircraft, operating with almost complete air superiority, struck at targets identified by forward observers. American infantrymen, taking shelter where they could find it, prepared to assault the Japanese positions once the bombardment subsided. This was the American way of war, overwhelming firepower applied methodically until enemy positions were either destroyed or abandoned. It had worked across the Pacific. It had worked on every island from Iwo Jima backward to Guadalcanal. Yet this time, the enemy did not abandon their positions. The Japanese did not retreat under bombardment. They stayed in their caves and bunkers, absorbed the incoming fire, and prepared to meet the American assault with devastating defensive fire. The attacks that followed revealed the magnitude of the strategic error that Japanese command had arranged. When American infantry pressed up the slopes toward Japanese positions, they walked into coordinated fire from machine guns, rifles, and mortars, positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. Men who had expected to find hastily prepared positions instead discovered carefully engineered defenses that seemed to multiply with every meter of ground they gained. Grenades thrown into apertures of bunkers detonated against interior deflection walls and caused minimal casualties. Bodies of Japanese soldiers, killed by artillery fire and air bombardment, lay mixed with live defenders who remained at their weapons and fired on the American assault troops advancing toward them. American casualty rates, which had been acceptable in the northern part of the island, suddenly became unsustainable. Company commanders reported their units reduced to platoon strength after assaults against single bunker complexes. Platoon leaders tried to call for support, but the firepower that had worked elsewhere seemed inadequate against positions that were simply too well prepared, too deeply dug in, and too stubbornly defended. The battle settled into a pattern that neither side had fully anticipated, though both had understood the possibility. American forces possessed overwhelming superiority in artillery, air support, naval gunfire, and overall numbers. Yet this superiority could be applied only at a pace that the terrain and Japanese defensive preparation would permit. Every meter of ground toward the Japanese positions had to be paid for in American casualties. Every Japanese strongpoint had to be identified, isolated, and then methodically destroyed through repeated assaults, artillery bombardment, and close air support. The Americans, a nation that had fought a war of maneuver and rapid exploitation across Europe, suddenly found themselves bogged down in a grinding war of attrition that resembled the trench warfare of World War I more than the mobile operations they had perfected in the Pacific. Officers struggled with the contradiction. They possessed the power to destroy the island itself, yet the enemy remained, firing from caves beneath the rubble, from positions that artillery had apparently already eliminated, from strongpoints that seemed to absorb punishment that should have been fatal. Japanese command, meanwhile, observed the growing American casualty rates with grim satisfaction. Ushijima and Yahara understood that they could not defeat this American force in any conventional sense, could not drive them back into the sea, or recapture territory that had been surrendered in the opening days. Their strategy was narrower and darker than that. Each American soldier killed on the slopes approaching Shuri was one fewer American available for the invasion of the Japanese home islands. Each day that the battle continued was one fewer day for American forces to rest, re-equip, and prepare for the assault on Honshu. The mathematics of attrition favored Japan only in the sense that they measured success not by ground retained, but by American blood spilled. The Shuri line had opened fire. The swift island takeover that American planners had envisioned was dead. In its place came a battle that would consume the island, exhaust both armies, and claim tens of thousands of lives before the outcome was determined, not by maneuver, but by simple accumulated cost. The transformation was psychological as well as tactical. American troops who had waded ashore expecting rapid victory and relatively light casualties now faced the reality of an enemy who would not break, would not retreat, and would not surrender in any numbers that made a difference. Replacements arriving from the United States landed into a battle that had already hardened into stalemate. Each new soldier immediately committed to assaults that seemed to accomplish little but to add their names to casualty lists. The islands of the Pacific had taught Americans to expect Japanese troops who would die rather than surrender. But this was different. This was Japanese troops who would die under tons of artillery fire, would die in caves they could not leave without exposure, would die in bunkers that served as their tombs. American officers understood that they would ultimately prevail. The mathematics of industrial war ensured it, but that understanding offered cold comfort to the men bleeding on the slopes in front of Shuri. The fortress had opened fire. The easy war was over. The American soldier advancing across Okinawa in mid-April had been promised a victory. His commanders had spoken of swift progress, of breaking through Japanese lines and racing toward the northern airfields. But by late April, as units pushed deeper into the island's southern sector, the reality became brutally different. The terrain itself seemed to have turned against them. Rolling hills and steep ridges that appeared manageable on maps became fortress walls when traversed on foot under fire. Among these obstacles stood two locations that would define the battle's character: Sugarloaf Hill, barely 150 feet above sea level, yet defended as though it were the last mountain on Earth, and a scarred ridgeline that American soldiers would come to call Hacksaw Ridge. These were not strategic jewels in the conventional sense. They held no ports, no airfields, no obvious military infrastructure, yet they became the grinding stones upon which the American offensive would be abraded for weeks, costing thousands of young men for a handful of dirt and rock. Sugarloaf Hill earned its derisive nickname from its peculiar shape, a rounded prominence that rose unexpectedly from the surrounding terrain. The Japanese had prepared it with meticulous care, honeycombing the hillside with interconnected caves and bunkers that converted the natural slope into a nearly impregnable defensive position. Supporting positions on adjacent hills, Half Moon Hill and Horseshoe Ridge, created interlocking fields of fire that made any assault from any direction a nightmare for the attackers. The American commanders who first encountered Sugarloaf expected it to fall within hours. Instead, the battle for control of this modest hill stretched across 16 days of relentless combat. Wave after wave of American infantry attacked up the slopes, only to be driven back by concentrated machine gun and mortar fire from positions the attackers could not effectively see. The Americans would capture the summit, plant their flag, and within hours find themselves surrounded as Japanese counterattacks from adjacent strongpoints cut off and overwhelmed the forward units. Then the Americans would have to assault again, and again, and again. The human cost accumulated with a sickening arithmetic. A platoon of 30 men would assault Sugarloaf and perhaps 5 would return unwounded. Another platoon would follow, and the percentage of casualties would repeat. By the 4th assault, by the 8th, by the 12th, the calculus became impossible to justify by any rational military standard, yet the assault orders continued. American artillery pounded the hill relentlessly, so much so that the terrain itself changed shape from the bombardment. Yet the Japanese defenders simply dug deeper, moved between their cave systems, and emerged whenever American infantry approached the summit. The problem became increasingly clear to the American soldiers in the forward lines. Conventional battlefield tactics did not work against this style of fortified defense. The enemy was not arrayed across open ground where artillery could devastate them in massed formations. They were distributed vertically through the hill itself, protected by tons of earth and rock from all but the most direct hits. Machine gunners could fire from positions so thoroughly concealed that pinpointing them required advancing close enough to draw their fire, which meant accepting casualties as the price of reconnaissance. Hacksaw Ridge presented a different, but equally maddening challenge. The ridgeline was genuinely broken terrain, fractured by ravines and outcrops that made movement difficult even without opposition. The Japanese had fortified the ridge with the same dedication they brought to Sugarloaf, and American units attacking along or across the ridgeline found themselves subject to enfilade fire from multiple directions. The name itself would become famous in later years, passed down through military history and eventually into popular culture. Yet in April 1945, it was simply another nightmare for the men tasked with taking it. The ridge was not a single position, but a complex of interconnected strongpoints, each one requiring its own dedicated assault. American companies would spend entire days gaining one ridge spur, only to discover that the next spur was even more heavily defended. The elevation changes meant that soldiers had to clamber over broken rock while carrying full equipment and ammunition, utterly exposed to Japanese observers positioned higher on the terrain. What made these smaller engagements so revealing was how they exposed the fundamental failures of American planning. The invasion planners at Pearl Harbor and San Francisco had anticipated Japanese resistance, surely, but they had not adequately grasped the scale and sophistication of the fortification program undertaken by Ushijima and Yahara. The estimates of Japanese defensive capabilities had been revised upward as reconnaissance revealed more and more cave systems and bunker networks, yet even these revised estimates remained too optimistic. The planners had assumed that Japanese defenses would crack under concentrated American firepower. that artillery and naval gunfire would suppress and destroy enemy positions, and that American infantry assault would then exploit the gaps. This formula had worked reasonably well in earlier island campaigns, where Japanese garrisons were smaller and less extensively fortified. But Okinawa was qualitatively different. The depth of the defensive system meant that even when American artillery succeeded in destroying one line of fortifications, another line of fortifications existed behind it. When one strong point fell, 3 more became apparent that had previously been masked from observation. The tactical problem manifested most clearly in the disparity between ground gained and casualties inflicted. American units would launch an assault, suffer 50% or 70% casualties, and gain perhaps 300 meters of ground. The next day, they would attack the next Japanese strongpoint and repeat the process. Over a week, a division might advance 1 or 2 kilometers, while losing more men than some entire regiments had lost in earlier campaigns. The mathematics of attrition began to work against the Americans in a way that no war game or planning session had anticipated. Supply lines stretched longer as the Americans pushed deeper into Japanese territory, and each push required more ammunition, more medical supplies, more replacement troops. Meanwhile, the Japanese were condensing their defenses into an ever smaller area, which meant they could concentrate their firepower more effectively, even as their numbers dwindled. The fighting for Sugarloaf and Hacksaw Ridge revealed something else that shook American confidence: the willingness of Japanese defenders to die rather than surrender, and perhaps more importantly, their ability to make such sacrifice operationally meaningful. In earlier campaigns, American soldiers had sometimes expressed frustration that fanatical Japanese resistance seemed pointless and wasteful. But on Okinawa, this very willingness to absorb unlimited casualties was translated into an effective defensive strategy. Every Japanese soldier who died in position, particularly in fortified terrain, forced the Americans to employ soldiers and firepower to remove the body from that position. This was not random slaughter, but calculated exchange. Japanese soldiers, aware they would likely die, chose to die in positions that inflicted maximum casualties on the Americans before they fell. It was a form of defense that required American planners and commanders to fundamentally reconsider their assumptions about how much progress should cost. The terrain around these contested hills became saturated with American artillery fire at levels that shocked even combat veterans. The supporting artillery batteries for American divisions were firing continuously, sometimes exhausting ammunition supplies faster than transport planes and ships could replenish them. The landscape itself was transformed by bombardment. Trees were vaporized, rock faces were shattered and reshattered. Soil turned to dust that hung in the air for hours after each barrage, reducing visibility and coating the soldiers advancing behind the artillery fire. Yet despite this apocalyptic level of firepower, the Japanese defenders emerged from their caves and bunkers to meet each assault. The Americans were learning a hard lesson that would prove crucial for understanding why Japan lost this battle, and why the war itself would only end when Japan's cities faced destruction on a scale that made the island battles seem almost modest by comparison. The battalion and company-level commanders responsible for these assaults faced impossible decisions. They could see that frontal assault up open slopes against prepared positions was extraordinarily expensive in lives. Yet they also understood that their mission was to take the objective, and Japanese command had made clear that defeat was not acceptable. The result was a grinding stalemate where American fire and manpower eventually prevailed, but not quickly and not cheaply. American tanks proved difficult to employ effectively on the broken terrain, and their presence did not obviously reduce American infantry casualties because the infantrymen still had to advance in the open while tanks provided supporting fire from positions where Japanese anti-tank weapons could engage them. The integration of American supporting arms, so celebrated in the early Pacific Island campaigns, seemed to stumble against the defensive complexity of Okinawa's fortified strongpoints. As American units finally secured Sugarloaf Hill and Hacksaw Ridge through sheer attrition, the lesson for higher command became unmistakable. The battle could not be won quickly. The notion that American firepower and tactical superiority would break Japanese resistance in days or weeks had been completely invalidated by the Okinawan reality. Instead, the Americans faced a campaign measured in months, requiring continuous reinforcement, consuming vast quantities of supplies, and accepting casualty rates that would have been unthinkable in earlier campaigns. The soldiers who finally planted their flags on these hard-won positions did so knowing that the battle was far from over, that the Japanese had already prepared additional defensive lines further south, and that everything they had just endured would be repeated across the next set of strongpoints. The Pimple and the Hacksaw Ridge had taught them that Okinawa was not a battle to be won, but a problem to be solved through systematic destruction of every fortified position, regardless of cost. The casualty figures from these engagements would later shock even the most hardened military statisticians. Some American divisions had lost more men in a few weeks on Okinawa than they had lost in entire campaigns against German forces in Europe, yet the Japanese were losing proportionally even more heavily, with casualties mounting faster than reinforcements could arrive. This dynamic created a paradox at the heart of the battle. Both sides were being ground down by the attrition, but the Americans had the industrial capacity and manpower reserves to absorb the losses, while the Japanese did not. Sugarloaf Hill and Hacksaw Ridge became microcosms of this broader truth. The Americans could afford to lose hundreds of men to capture a hill. The Japanese could not afford to lose hundreds of men to hold a hill, yet they did so anyway because Ushijima's strategy demanded maximum casualties to delay American advance, regardless of what that meant for Japan's ultimate ability to defend itself. By the time American forces secured these contested positions, the broader battle had already begun to shift. The kamikaze attacks against the American fleet were reaching their crescendo. American reinforcements were pouring ashore in unprecedented numbers. The Japanese were beginning to fall back toward their final defensive positions in the southern peninsula. Yet the blood spent on Sugarloaf and Hacksaw Ridge represented in microcosm the fundamental problem facing Japan, a military doctrine and strategic vision that demanded sacrifice without offering any path to victory. The soldiers who died on these hills had purchased time, but time was becoming Japan's scarcest resource. Every day that the Japanese continued to fight meant one more day closer to the arrival of Soviet forces in Manchuria, one more day closer to the complete isolation of Japan from any remaining sources of supply and support. The small battles had contributed to the larger story, but that larger story was not one of Japanese triumph through sacrifice. It was a story of mutual destruction, in which the side with fewer resources to spare was the one absorbing the highest casualties. The Japanese had built their fortress with one critical assumption, that their soldiers would be able to absorb American firepower through superior positioning and depth. What they had not fully anticipated was the sheer industrial capacity of the American war machine to concentrate destruction across a single landscape with precision and relentless continuity. When the first American infantry columns advanced southward into the prepared defensive zone in the second week of April, they discovered that their traditional methods of assault, sending men forward with rifles and grenades against enemy positions, would no longer suffice. The Japanese had solved the equation of positional defense with engineering. The Americans would solve it with mathematics, calculation of angles, trajectory, powder charge, and the mathematics of accumulated fire. Within days, the nature of the battle transformed from a question of courage or maneuver into a question of raw destructive power applied with industrial discipline. The foundation of American firepower on Okinawa rested on a simple principle that had matured over 4 years of Pacific combat. Suppress the enemy with such overwhelming bombardment that infantry assault becomes a mopping-up operation rather than a frontal attack against prepared resistance. The United States deployed nearly 300 artillery pieces across the island, ranging from small 75mm guns supporting individual regiments to massive 240mm howitzers that could deliver shells weighing nearly 300 pounds across distances of more than 30 kilometers. These batteries worked in coordinated networks, with forward observers calling in fire corrections from the front lines while fire direction centers calculated deflection, range, and charge time with mechanical precision. On a typical day in May, American artillery batteries would fire more than 10,000 rounds, sustained bombardment that created a continuous thunder audible across the entire island. The ground itself seemed to shake with a secondary existence, vibrating beneath Japanese positions as if the very earth had become a weapon in American hands. What made American artillery dominance possible was not merely the quantity of guns, but the system of command and supply that kept them fed with ammunition, spotters, and targeting information. The United States had invested heavily in logistics, establishing ammunition dumps, supply depots, and repair facilities across northern Okinawa that enabled sustained fire rates that no Japanese supply line could match. Forward observers, equipped with radio sets and binoculars, positioned themselves near the front lines to direct fire onto Japanese positions with accuracy that improved with each passing week. These observers could call in artillery strikes within minutes of identifying targets, creating a feedback loop where information became fire and fire became destruction. The American gunners themselves operated under a doctrine of continuous support. Artillery would not simply respond to requests, but would maintain preparatory bombardment throughout daylight hours, keeping Japanese forces pinned and unable to move, resupply, or reinforce threatened sectors. Naval gunfire added another dimension to American destructive capability, a dimension that the Japanese simply could not replicate. American battleships, cruisers, and destroyers anchored offshore possessed guns that could deliver projectiles weighing as much as 2,000 pounds with devastating accuracy, targeting Japanese positions from ranges of more than 30 kilometers. Ships like the battleship New York could concentrate their entire broadside, 9 massive 15-inch guns firing in unison, onto a single Japanese strongpoint, each salvo capable of destroying fortifications that might require days of ground assault to overcome otherwise. Naval fire control systems, refined through years of combat, could engage moving targets or fixed positions with remarkable precision, and the psychological impact of shells arriving from invisible sources across the horizon affected Japanese morale in ways that land-based artillery could not. The Japanese had no comparable naval gunfire support available. Their battleships destroyed or trapped in home waters, their coastal defense guns vulnerable to American air superiority. Naval gunfire support became a luxury available exclusively to the Americans, an overwhelming advantage that Japanese engineers could neither defend against nor overcome. Yet for all this accumulated firepower, the Japanese defensive system possessed characteristics that limited how effectively bombardment could achieve its purpose. The extensive cave networks, some extending more than 200 meters into hillsides, could protect soldiers from everything except a direct hit on their entrance. And caves had multiple entrances that made sealing them difficult, even when Americans could identify their locations. Fortified blockhouses, built from concrete and earth with walls more than 2 meters thick, could withstand repeated strikes from howitzer shells without collapsing, particularly when positions were carefully dug into hillsides where the mass of earth behind them absorbed concussive force. The Japanese had learned through experience in previous battles that deep fortifications survived bombardment better than surface defenses, and they had applied this lesson with engineering skill that American planners had underestimated. Artillery could suppress a position, keeping soldiers pinned and unable to fire effectively, but suppression differed from destruction. A suppressed enemy could remain in place, waiting, and when the artillery lifted to allow an infantry assault, defenders could emerge from their caves and blockhouses to resist the advancing Americans anew. The American response to this persistent problem was to combine artillery with other forms of fire support in sequences designed to overwhelm Japanese positions through cumulative effect rather than single devastating strikes. Close air support from fighter bombers became integrated into the tactical framework, with aircraft arriving on call to strafe and bomb positions identified by ground observers. Flamethrowers, employed by specially trained engineers, would assault Japanese cave entrances and fortified positions directly, using burning napalm to drive defenders out or incinerate them inside their shelters. Demolition teams would plant explosives at cave entrances and blow them shut, entombing Japanese soldiers inside if they refused to surrender. This combination of distant fire support and intimate close-quarters assault meant that Japanese soldiers faced a progression of threats: artillery and naval gunfire from afar, aircraft overhead, and finally American infantrymen moving across broken ground toward their positions. The depth of Japanese defenses remained an asset, but it could not protect against an enemy willing to combine overwhelming firepower with aggressive close assault tactics. The concentration of artillery firepower had another critical effect beyond simple suppression. It became a tool of psychological warfare that degraded Japanese fighting capacity over weeks of continuous bombardment. Soldiers sheltering in caves day after day while earth and stone shook around them, hearing the constant whistle of incoming shells, experiencing the claustrophobia of extended confinement, and knowing that rations were depleting while American firepower remained inexhaustible, began to lose the will to resist. Japanese officers noted in their records the deteriorating morale caused by endless bombardment, the way men became exhausted by constant alertness and the nerve-wracking anticipation of the next impact. Some Japanese soldiers, particularly those lacking ideological commitment or those who had been conscripted into service, began to lose belief in the possibility of victory. The American artillery became not merely a tool of destruction, but a constant psychological pressure that ground away at Japanese resistance through a mechanism invisible but undeniable. American artillery also enabled a tactical flexibility that the Japanese could not match. The ability to shift fires from one sector to another with speed and concentration that allowed American commanders to support breakthrough operations with overwhelming suppressive fire. When American commanders decided to concentrate forces against a particular Japanese strongpoint, they could immediately redirect hundreds of artillery pieces to that sector, creating a temporary firepower concentration so intense that Japanese defenders either surrendered, retreated, or were destroyed. This flexibility of response meant that American tactical victories, once achieved, could be rapidly exploited before Japanese reserves could reinforce threatened positions. Artillery would isolate the breakthrough area, preventing Japanese counterattacks or reinforcements, while American infantry pushed forward knowing their flanks were protected by fire. The Japanese, lacking this artillery reserve and lacking the ammunition to sustain continuous bombardment, even if they had possessed the guns, could not respond with equivalent countermeasures. The sustainability of American firepower created a strategic advantage that accumulated over time, a cumulative degradation of Japanese capacity that mathematical analysis could have predicted from the earliest weeks of the campaign. Every day of bombardment consumed American ammunition from seemingly inexhaustible supplies, brought in by cargo ships from distant stockpiles, while depleting Japanese ammunition stored on the island before the battle began. Every shell that landed on a Japanese position, even if it did not destroy a bunker or blockhouse, further degraded the will and physical capacity of the defender to resist. The Japanese faced a strategic dilemma without resolution. They could not generate sufficient firepower to suppress American assault. They could not generate sufficient supplies to sustain themselves indefinitely, and they lacked the mobility to evade American encirclement. Artillery thus became not merely a tactical tool, but a strategic weapon that embodied the underlying imbalance between Japanese and American industrial capacity. The human cost of American artillery dominance was borne primarily by Japanese defenders, unable to respond effectively. Though American infantry suffered significant casualties moving across open ground toward defended positions, even after hours of bombardment had reduced those positions to rubble. The explosion of shells, the flying fragments of rock and concrete and steel, the collapse of hillsides and the opening of new crevasses across the landscape created a terrain of death even before close combat began. Japanese soldiers who emerged from caves to assault American lines faced artillery fire that fell with minimal warning, strikes that killed dozens in a single explosion. Yet the American infantrymen who attacked those positions, moving through smoke and dust across broken ground toward enemies they could not always see, suffered their own heavy casualties despite the artillery support that supposedly had neutralized resistance. Artillery could degrade an enemy position, but rarely could eliminate all resistance, and soldiers who survived bombardment by sheltering in caves could emerge to fight again, particularly if they were committed to dying rather than surrendering. The relationship between American firepower and American infantry became reciprocal, each element supporting the other in a synergy that the Japanese could not replicate or overcome. Artillery enabled infantry assault by suppressing enemy fire and destroying surface fortifications, while successful infantry assault created opportunities for artillery to engage new targets revealed by advancing troops. This integration of fire and maneuver, refined through training and experimentation across years of the Pacific Campaign, created a tactical system that proved devastatingly effective against positional defense. Japanese counteroffensives, launched into the face of this firepower coordination, suffered catastrophic casualties that Japanese commanders seemed unable to prevent or overcome. The battle became not a test of courage or tactical cleverness, but a test of industrial capacity and logistical endurance, domains where the United States possessed overwhelming advantage. As May progressed and American forces ground forward against Japanese defensive positions, the evidence accumulated that artillery dominance, while not achieving victory by itself, had created conditions where Japanese military defeat became mathematically inevitable. The question remaining was not whether Japanese forces would be defeated, but how many casualties would be inflicted before that defeat became complete and formal. Ushijima's fortress, however expertly constructed and however stubbornly defended, could not stand against an enemy that could concentrate hundreds of guns to pulverize any position that attempted to resist. The Japanese had built their defense on the assumption that American infantry would assault their lines in conventional attack waves susceptible to machine gun fire and artillery counterfire. Instead, American artillery had become the primary assault weapon, grinding away Japanese positions through accumulated bombardment, while infantry advanced in the shadows cast by that overwhelming firepower. The battle's outcome, in many respects, had already been determined by the moment that American artillery fully deployed across northern Okinawa, even as the fighting itself would continue for weeks more, through late spring and into early summer, each day adding new names to the casualty lists on both sides. By the middle of May 1945, the mathematical reality of Okinawa had become impossible to ignore. The American forces arrayed against the 32nd Army had swollen to more than 500,000 troops, supported by nearly 2,000 aircraft and over 1,500 ships. General Mitsuru Ushijima, commanding from his underground headquarters carved into the limestone ridge near Shuri, faced not a tactical problem, but a strategic equation that had stopped adding up weeks before. His army, which had begun the battle with approximately 110,000 soldiers, had been reduced through 5 weeks of continuous combat to perhaps 60,000 effectives. Ammunition ran low. Medical supplies had become nearly non-existent. Reinforcements would never arrive. Yet the Americans kept coming, methodical and patient, accepting casualties to grind down Japanese positions one bloodied section at a time. In the darkness of that headquarters, two men wrestled with the question that would define the final chapter of Okinawa's agony. What should they do when it became clear they could not win? General Ushijima was a figure caught between worlds. At age 59, he carried the weight of samurai tradition in a body grown old from decades of military service. He was not a fanatic, but neither was he a pragmatist in the Western sense. He understood honor as a force more concrete than terrain, more binding than any written order. Throughout his career, Ushijima had internalized the code that demanded a commander attack when circumstances demanded it, that defense without the possibility of counterattack was merely slow surrender wearing a uniform. To remain passive in the face of American pressure felt, to him, like a betrayal of everything his soldiers had sacrificed. He had committed 100,000 men to holding Okinawa. They were dying daily, some from artillery, some from assault rifle fire, some slowly bleeding out in caves without medical help. How could he ask them to accept this without offering them at least one moment of chance, one thrust forward when the enemy might be vulnerable? Beside Ushijima sat Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, the 32nd Army's chief of staff, and the principal architect of the defensive strategy that had so effectively delayed American victory. Where Ushijima embodied tradition, Yahara represented calculation. He was younger by nearly a decade, trained in staff work and logistics, comfortable with numbers and projections. Yahara had witnessed what effective defense could accomplish. He had seen American casualties pile up against the Shuri line, had watched rifle companies reduced to platoons, had observed the American advance slow to meters per day. He understood something that Ushijima seemed reluctant to accept, that in a battle already lost, the only remaining objective was to ensure the enemy paid the highest possible price for victory. Every day the Americans remained tied down on Okinawa was a day they were not preparing for the final assault on the Japanese home islands. Every 1,000 American casualties absorbed here was 1,000 men unavailable for that coming catastrophe. From Yahara's perspective, counterattack was not honor, counterattack was waste. The disagreement between these two men crystallized around a specific proposal that had begun circulating through Japanese command circles in early May. Ushijima and his operations staff had conceived of a major counteroffensive, a concentrated assault aimed at breaking through American lines and recapturing the initiative. The plan called for massed infantry attacks, armor support from remaining Japanese tanks, and coordinated strikes designed to rupture the American advance and perhaps even force a temporary withdrawal. On the surface, it possessed the appeal of decisive action. On paper, it satisfied the cultural imperative toward attack. But Yahara saw it clearly for what it was, a death sentence masquerading as strategy. His analysis was brutal and honest. Japanese forces no longer possessed the ammunition reserves to sustain intensive offensive operations. American air superiority meant that any massing of troops would be detected and attacked before an assault could even begin. The remaining Japanese tanks were fuel-starved and mechanically unreliable. Most importantly, any commitment of available reserves to a counteroffensive would eliminate the possibility of conducting further defensive operations once those reserves were exhausted. The tension between these two officers grew sharper as May progressed. Ushijima was receiving pressure from higher command in Tokyo, from officers who could not see the battlefield directly and who believed that the right combination of courage and sacrifice could still alter the outcome. Ushijima also felt the weight of his soldiers' suffering. He moved through the headquarters and observed the wounded, the sick, the men reduced to hollow shells by weeks of combat. To do nothing felt, increasingly, like abandoning them. He began to lean toward the counteroffensive, seeing in it at least the possibility of restoring momentum, of giving his men one final moment of agency rather than passive acceptance of death. It was a human instinct, born from leadership and compassion. Yet it was also precisely the kind of thinking that had driven Japanese strategy throughout the war toward disaster after disaster. Yahara, for his part, recognized what he was witnessing, the gradual capitulation of his commander to the very impulses that Yahara had come to see as the greatest enemy Japan faced. Not the Americans, not the tanks or the artillery or the aircraft. The enemy was the cultural insistence on glorious assault when wisdom demanded defensive sacrifice. Yahara had written extensively about the virtues of defense, about the mathematics of forcing an enemy to pay escalating costs for territory. He understood that Japan could not win Okinawa. The question was whether Japan would allow the Americans to pay heavily for taking it, or whether Japan would throw away what remained of its forces in gestures of defiance that would be forgotten before the ink dried on the casualty reports. Yahara began arguing his position more forcefully. He pulled together ammunition counts and fuel inventories. He briefed Ushijima on enemy capabilities and air superiority statistics. He presented the logic as clearly as any staff officer could present logic to a commander who was increasingly wrestling with his conscience rather than his intellect. The debate between Ushijima and Yahara represented something far larger than a disagreement between two senior officers. It was the collision between two fundamentally different interpretations of what duty meant, what honor required, what sacrifice could accomplish. For Ushijima, duty meant attacking, meant demonstrating through action that his army would not submit to American dominance without making the enemy earn every meter of ground through blood and fire. Attack was not strategy in the conventional sense. It was moral assertion. It was the samurai demanding his moment of personal engagement with the foe, even when the larger battle was already decided. For Yahara, duty meant clarity, meant accepting reality and maximizing the consequence of that reality for one's adversary. To counterattack when counterattack could not succeed was to waste lives for the sake of ritual. To defend effectively, to trade space for enemy casualties, to extend the battle indefinitely, was to serve Japan's true interest, which lay not in winning Okinawa, but in demonstrating that invading the Japanese home islands would be so catastrophically expensive that even American determination might find it prohibitive. As mid-May arrived, the debate moved from academic discussion to imminent reality. American pressure on the Shuri line was becoming unsustainable. The Japanese defensive positions, however skillfully constructed and tenaciously held, could not withstand the combination of artillery bombardment, naval gunfire, and coordinated infantry assault that the Americans were now consistently executing. Ushijima sensed that the window for any offensive action was closing rapidly. If he was going to authorize the counteroffensive, it would have to be now, while Japanese forces still possessed sufficient concentration to attempt it. Yahara sensed the same thing and argued with growing urgency that such an attempt would be futile. He had come to see the most important service he could render to Japan was to ensure that his commander understood the true cost of the choice being made. Ushijima was not an unintelligent man. He was not irrational, but he was a man facing a decision that transcended logic, a decision between two forms of defeat and asking which form was more honorable, more true to the obligations he carried. The historical record shows that Ushijima, by late May, had moved significantly toward acceptance of the counteroffensive plan. Perhaps he had been convinced by the arguments of his operations staff, or perhaps he had simply concluded that Yahara's counsel, however logical, was not the counsel of a true soldier. Perhaps he felt that the emperor and the homeland were watching, that some gesture of defiance was necessary regardless of outcome. Perhaps the accumulated exhaustion of weeks of command, the constant stream of casualty reports and requests for reinforcements that could never arrive, had worn down his capacity for calculation. The exact moment of his decision remains difficult to pinpoint in the historical record, but by the first week of May, it became clear that Ushijima was resolved on action. Yahara, recognizing that he could not change his commander's mind, did what a loyal staff officer does. He began planning how to execute the counteroffensive in the manner most likely to succeed, even as he remained convinced it would fail. This dynamic between Ushijima and Yahara illuminates something essential about the Japanese military in 1945. By this stage of the war, the high command had become a world of conflicting imperatives. Younger officers like Yahara had absorbed modern military theory and understood that technology and firepower had rendered 19th century tactics obsolete. Older officers like Ushijima remained tethered to a cultural code that measured valor not by outcome but by the commitment to fight. Neither was necessarily wrong in isolation. Both were responding rationally to their own frameworks of meaning, but those frameworks were incompatible, and the collision between them would play out not in headquarters debates, but in the deaths of thousands of ordinary soldiers who would pay the price for a decision they had no voice in making. The counteroffensive would come. Yahara would help plan it. Ushijima would order it. And both men would watch it fail in precisely the manner Yahara's analysis had predicted. What made this crisis so significant was that it occurred at a moment when the outcome of the battle was still mechanically uncertain but psychologically decided. American forces were growing stronger daily. Japanese forces were deteriorating daily. Yet the battle continued, and as long as it continued, decisions made in that underground headquarters near Shuri would determine whether Japanese soldiers would die trying to recapture lost ground or die defending positions they held. The choice between these two forms of dying seemed, to Ushijima, to carry moral weight. The choice seemed to Yahara purely practical. Which approach would more effectively punish the American aggressor? The disagreement was not one that could be resolved through compromise. Either the counteroffensive would be ordered or it would not. Either Okinawa would see a sudden escalation of Japanese aggression or it would not. By the end of the first week of May, the answer had crystallized in Ushijima's mind, even if Yahara had not abandoned his opposition. This moment of crisis in the Japanese command structure represented the beginning of the end for organized Japanese resistance on Okinawa. The decision to counterattack would accelerate the collapse of the defensive line. The resources committed to that attack would be irretrievably lost. The momentum gained would be temporary and costly. Yet from Ushijima's perspective, it was necessary. From Yahara's perspective, it was inevitable. Both men understood that they were witnessing the final gasps of an empire that had committed its last reserves to a cause that could not be saved. The mathematics were inexorable. The only question left was how much blood would be spilled in acknowledgement of that mathematics before everyone involved finally accepted it as truth. By early May, the battle for Okinawa had settled into a suffocating stalemate. The Americans controlled the northern two-thirds of the island and were grinding steadily southward, their artillery turning the landscape into something between a moonscape and a graveyard. General Mitsuru Ushijima and his soldiers had inflicted casualties far beyond what American commanders had anticipated, yet the grinding attrition worked both ways. Every day brought fewer Japanese soldiers to hold the line, fewer shells for the artillery positions, fewer supplies moving through the network of caves and tunnels that honeycombed the Shuri heights. The Japanese strategy of bleeding the Americans white had succeeded in one sense. The invasion force was paying in blood and suffering. But success in attrition means nothing if your own side runs dry first, and by the beginning of May, Ushijima's force was approaching a point of collapse from which no amount of determination could recover. This moment of crisis forced a brutal decision between two fundamentally opposed views of how to fight the remainder of the battle. Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, the chief of staff and the architect of the Shuri defensive line, saw the mathematics clearly. Japan had lost ground steadily, yes, but the Americans had lost soldiers steadily as well. The longer the campaign continued, the more American casualties would mount, and in Yahara's calculation, those casualties mattered more than the yard-by-yard loss of terrain. American losses on Okinawa would echo in Washington. They would demoralize the home front. They would demonstrate the terrifying cost of invading Japan's home islands. The longer Ushijima could sustain the battle, the more leverage Japan might possess in whatever negotiations the empire hoped might yet emerge from the wreckage of the war. Yahara urged a continued strategy of defensive depth, of trading space for American blood, of holding pockets of resistance until American casualties reached truly catastrophic levels. It was a strategy born not of hope but of mathematics, a clear-eyed assessment that Japan could no longer win in any conventional sense, and could only hope to make the victory so expensive that the Americans might accept something less than unconditional surrender. General Ushijima saw things differently, and his view carried the weight of military tradition, personal honor, and a visceral need to reverse the momentum of the campaign. Ushijima was no fool. He understood the mathematics as well as Yahara did, but he also understood that soldiers do not merely calculate, they also follow orders and respond to the example of their commanders. The more ground Japan lost without striking back, the more soldiers questioned whether their sacrifice meant anything, whether the officers were truly leading them toward victory or merely prolonging their suffering before inevitable defeat. For Ushijima, the strategy of ceding ground indefinitely risked the psychological collapse of his force before the Americans even had to assault the final defensive line. The general looked at his remaining reserves, at the armor and mechanized units that still possessed some mobility and striking power, and he believed that one powerful counterattack, launched with concentration and violence, could shatter the American advance and restore the initiative to Japanese hands. The moment for such a blow was narrowing, he knew. If he waited much longer, there would be nothing left to counterattack with. The decision had to come now, in early May, before the Americans could consolidate completely and before Japanese resources evaporated entirely. Yahara argued passionately against the gamble. The chief of staff knew from intelligence reports and observation that American air superiority was absolute, that any Japanese formation moving in daylight would be smashed by aircraft before it could even engage the American ground forces. The plan called for the attack to proceed on the 4th of May, and Yahara warned that Japanese armor moving toward the American lines would be exposed to anti-tank aircraft and strafing runs that would devastate the columns long before they reached their objectives. He pointed out that ammunition reserves were already critically low and that a major offensive would consume supplies needed to sustain the defense later. Yahara's warnings were grounded in operational reality, yet they clashed fundamentally with Ushijima's belief that bold action remained possible and that the psychological impact of a major counteroffensive might compensate for the inevitable losses. The two men respected each other and had worked in partnership to construct Okinawa's defenses, but now they stood on opposite sides of a divide that no amount of discussion could bridge. In the end, Ushijima held the authority to decide, and he decided to attack. The counteroffensive was scheduled to commence on the 4th of May, with coordinated assaults against American positions across a wide front. The plan called for armor and mechanized units to strike the American center, while infantry formations attacked on the flanks, aiming to break through and drive the Americans back, creating enough chaos and disruption to shift the balance of the battle. Japanese planners selected what they believed were weak points in the American line, places where the terrain or positioning might offer an advantage. The 2nd Armored Group, a formation that had been preserved in reserve, would form the striking force, supported by infantry battalions that had been rested and resupplied relative to the units holding the front lines. General Ushijima issued orders with the confidence of a commander who has decided to commit everything to a single throw of the dice. There was something almost defiant in the gesture, a refusal to accept the passive role that Yahara advocated, a last assertion that Japan's military could seize the initiative rather than merely respond to American actions. Officers throughout the Japanese command welcomed the opportunity to attack, to move forward rather than absorb endless bombardment while retreating steadily. The counteroffensive represented a fundamental change in tone after weeks of grinding defensive warfare. What happened next demonstrated, with terrible clarity, why Yahara's warnings had merit. As Japanese armor and infantry formations moved toward the American lines in daylight on the 4th of May, they became visible to American aircraft patrolling above Okinawa. The destruction was swift and overwhelming. American fighter bombers descended on the Japanese columns, strafing armor formations and concentrations of infantry with rockets and machine gun fire. The Japanese had no air cover, no effective air defense beyond rifle and machine gun fire at aircraft, no means to contest American control of the skies. The 2nd Armored Group was shattered almost before it could engage the American lines. Tank after tank was knocked out or damaged, crews killed or scattered, the formation's coherence dissolved into chaos and burning wreckage. Infantry units following the armor found themselves exposed to air attack and began suffering casualties before they even reached prepared defensive positions to assault. The assault divisions committed to the counteroffensive pushed forward despite the losses, driven by orders and by the momentum of the attack, but they were moving into a firestorm. On the ground, American infantry and armor responded to the Japanese attack with disciplined firepower. The Americans had been expecting something, had reinforced certain sectors anticipating that the static nature of the battle could not continue indefinitely. When Japanese troops and vehicles began advancing, American artillery and machine guns opened fire with devastating effect. The attack was met not by panicked Americans fleeing their positions, but by coordinated defensive fire that tore through the Japanese formations. The numerical advantage in firepower, which America had maintained throughout the campaign, was amplified by the fact that the Japanese were attacking prepared defenses rather than defending them. American soldiers had the advantage of terrain knowledge, prepared firing positions, and supporting firepower that had been coordinated and tested over weeks of combat. Japanese soldiers, meanwhile, were attacking into this prepared strength without adequate armor support, without air cover, without the reserves that could sustain the attack if the initial assault failed. The counteroffensive began to collapse almost immediately, though Japanese units continued attacking because they had been ordered to attack. Over the course of May 4th and into May 5th, the counteroffensive was systematically dismantled. Attacks that had been planned with hope and launched with determination turned into desperate attempts to regain momentum that was never actually achieved. Infantry units that had been promised armor support found themselves committed to assault after the armor had been destroyed. Ammunition supplies that were already scarce were consumed in massive volumes by the offensive operations. American air support, calling in close air support and diverted from other missions, added artillery-level firepower to the defense. American reinforcements, held in reserve for exactly this type of contingency, were moved forward to strengthen threatened sectors. The Japanese counterattack never achieved breakthrough in any sector, never forced the Americans to retreat any significant distance, never shifted the momentum of the campaign. Instead, it accomplished exactly what Yahara had predicted. It consumed the last of Japan's operational reserves, destroyed irreplaceable armor and mechanized units, and depleted ammunition stockpiles that could not be replenished. The counteroffensive was not merely a tactical failure. It was a catastrophic strategic defeat that sealed the fate of the battle. By May 6th, it was clear that the counteroffensive had failed completely. Japanese units reported back to headquarters that they had sustained devastating losses without achieving their objectives. The survivors retreated back toward the defensive lines or scattered into smaller formations that could not be easily reconstituted. The Second Armored Group, the formation that had been preserved as Japan's striking force, no longer existed as an organized unit. Ushijima faced the reality that Yahara had warned about. Japan's remaining reserves had been consumed in a gamble that had not paid off, and the Japanese defensive position was now weaker than it had been before the attack. The decision to counterattack had been made by a commander who believed that bold action remained possible, but the decision had been executed in an environment where American firepower, air superiority, and numbers made such bold action suicidal. Ushijima had gambled that he could restore momentum and initiative. Instead, he had accelerated the collapse of his own command. The failure of the May 4th counteroffensive shattered the psychological foundation of Japanese resistance on Okinawa. Soldiers who had been holding defensive positions, accepting casualties as the price of slowing the American advance, could now see clearly that their command had no plan for ultimate victory, that the best their officers could attempt was dramatic gesture rather than meaningful strategy. The loss of the armor formations that had seemed like reserves meant that future American advances could not be contested with anything more than infantry and artillery. The ammunition expended in the counteroffensive meant that the Japanese defensive positions would have less firepower to bring to bear on future American assaults. The failure of the attack meant that Ushijima's immediate alternative was to retreat again, to cede more ground, to continue the strategy of attrition that Yahara had advocated. In effect, the counteroffensive had reversed the decision-making authority. It had demonstrated that Ushijima's approach was impossible and validated Yahara's analysis. But it had done so only after consuming the resources that might have made the strategy of defensive depth truly effective. The Japanese defense would continue, would extract further American casualties, but it would do so from progressively weaker positions with fewer resources. Yahara himself survived the counteroffensive and continued his duties as chief of staff, guiding the retreat and the organization of successive defensive positions as the Japanese were pushed further south toward the Kian Peninsula. The relationship between Ushijima and Yahara remained professional and respectful, but the tension between their two strategic visions had been resolved not by debate but by failure. Ushijima had committed to boldness and had lost, leaving him no choice but to follow the path of measured retreat that Yahara had advocated. The weeks ahead would bring continued fighting, continued suffering, continued attrition, but they would bring no hope of reversing the outcome. The May 4th counteroffensive represented the last moment when Japanese command attempted to seize the initiative, the last time when Japanese strategy tried to break the deadlock rather than endure it. After May 6th, the Battle of Okinawa became what Yahara had foreseen, a grinding progression toward Japanese defeat, sustained not by hope of victory but by obligation to continue fighting, sustained by soldiers who had been taught that surrender was worse than death, and by a command structure that could not order retreat without compromising the honor that military training had drilled into every officer and soldier. The failure of the counteroffensive also marked a turning point in American operations. The American commanders had feared that the Japanese might possess reserves and striking power that could genuinely disrupt their advance. The destruction of the 2nd Armored Group and the hemorrhaging of Japanese infantry formations in the May 4th attack removed that fear, confirmed that American resources and firepower had achieved absolute superiority, and suggested that the remaining Japanese resistance, while stubborn and costly, would be methodical to overcome rather than dangerous to confront. American planners began to see not a battle that might turn against them, but a campaign that would continue for weeks, but which ultimately possessed no mystery about its outcome. The Japanese were not going to produce some hidden reserve that would drive the Americans back into the sea, were not going to achieve some dramatic reversal that would change the balance. The Americans would continue advancing, would continue absorbing casualties, but they would continue advancing. The May 4th counteroffensive had ended not just the possibility of Japanese operational success, but also the strategic uncertainty that had characterized the earlier phases of the campaign. What Ushijima had hoped would be a knife thrust that split American resolve became instead a hammer blow that fell only upon the Japanese themselves. The general had been presented with two strategic paths, to follow Yahara's mathematics of attrition and continue fighting until the Americans had paid the maximum possible price, or to attempt one dramatic offensive that might restore Japanese momentum and initiative. He had chosen the dramatic offensive, and the choice had been wrong. The forces under his command had not possessed the resources to make such an offensive succeed, had not possessed air cover or adequate armor or sufficient ammunition, or enough supplies to sustain a massed assault. The environment of the battle, the absolute American air superiority, the prepared American defenses, the American ability to mass firepower, had rendered such a bold attack not brave but impossible. The May 4th counteroffensive would be remembered as the moment when Japanese hope on Okinawa died, when the last attempt to shape the course of the campaign failed, when the island's fate shifted from uncertain to inevitable. The remaining weeks of the Battle of Okinawa would be a marathon of suffering, but the race had already been decided. In the waters surrounding Okinawa, a different kind of battle unfolded. While ground forces clashed across the island's broken terrain, the American fleet faced an enemy that attacked not with overwhelming firepower, but with absolute commitment to death. The Japanese air arm, already depleted by years of war and pilots lost across the Pacific, transformed its remaining aircraft and trained personnel into weapons designed to pierce the American naval shield through sheer audacity and sacrifice. What American sailors encountered in May and June of 1945 was not a conventional air campaign, but rather a calculated assault on the psychology and material resources of an invasion fleet. The waters became a proving ground where Japanese air doctrine, rooted in ideas of honor and superiority, collided with American naval discipline and damage control that had been refined through years of Pacific warfare. The Japanese military leadership understood a fundamental truth about the American invasion. The fleet anchored off Okinawa was not merely a fighting force, it was the backbone of supply, reinforcement, and fire support that kept the American ground forces advancing. Destroy or disable enough ships, the reasoning went, and the American army would be forced to retreat or remain static, buying time for ground forces to inflict catastrophic casualties. This logic drove Operation Kikusui, a sustained series of coordinated air attacks launched against the American fleet over a period of 10 weeks. The operation was not planned as a single massive assault, but rather as a series of overlapping waves, each designed to maximize American losses while preserving scarce Japanese aircraft through careful coordination and timing. Between the 1st of April and the 22nd of June, Japanese air forces launched 10 major raids against the American fleet, each one involving hundreds of aircraft, though not all aircraft committed to the effort were fitted with bombs as kamikaze weapons. The early April attacks began shortly after American forces secured beachheads on the western coast. Japanese commanders had anticipated the invasion timing with remarkable accuracy, and the first waves of attackers caught the American fleet in a moment of relative vulnerability, with vessels scattered across operating areas and defensive preparations still being strengthened. The Japanese committed approximately 350 aircraft to the opening phase, intending to overwhelm American defensive reactions through sheer numbers and coordinated assault. What transpired demonstrated both the desperation of Japanese strategy and the growing sophistication of American fleet air defense. Some Japanese aircraft reached American ships through gaps in fighter coverage, or by attacking at dawn and dusk, when light conditions favored attackers over defenders. The destroyer USS Emmons, the minesweeper USS Emmons, and other vessels suffered significant damage from near misses and direct attacks. Larger warships like the battleship USS West Virginia and cruisers took hits that killed or wounded sailors and sparked fires that threatened to spread beyond the capacity of damage control parties. As the campaign continued through May, the tempo of Japanese attacks intensified, rather than diminished, revealing how thoroughly Tokyo had committed to the Okinawa naval campaign. The second major wave struck in mid-May, again involving hundreds of aircraft, and this time American commanders had repositioned the fleet and strengthened defensive formations. Yet despite these adjustments, Japanese pilots continued to penetrate American defenses, particularly through coordinated attacks designed to overwhelm specific sectors or exploit gaps in fighter patrol coverage. The destroyer USS Evans, the minesweeper USS Swallow, and the fast mine layer USS Terror were among the vessels struck and damaged in these assaults. More significant were the damage patterns inflicted on larger ships. The battleship USS New Mexico took kamikazes that killed dozens of sailors and ignited fires in superstructure spaces. The escort carrier USS Sangamon was hit and damaged. These strikes accumulated, not in single catastrophic blows that would have been visible to newspaper readers in America, but in a steady accumulation of damaged vessels, burned compartments, and mounting casualties. The experience of American sailors during these attacks revealed the psychological and material dimensions of kamikaze assault that conventional bombing could not replicate. When a standard bombing raid approached, sailors could track the aircraft on radar, watch fighters intercept them, and observe bombs falling from altitude where defensive fire might deflect them. When a kamikaze appeared, by contrast, the goal of the pilot was to ensure contact regardless of defensive fire. The aircraft became the weapon, and the pilot's determination to achieve contact became the mechanism of destruction. Sailors manning anti-aircraft guns faced an enemy who would not break off when fired upon, would not attempt evasive maneuvers to evade gunfire, and whose entire purpose was to make contact with the ship. The psychological impact of facing this kind of attack proved profound and durable, shaping how American sailors viewed the war and the enemy they faced. Veterans described the experience as distinctly different from conventional air attacks, less a technical contest between aircraft and defenses, and more an assault on human will and nerve. The coordination and planning behind Operation Kikusui revealed a Japanese military that, despite material desperation, had not abandoned sophisticated operational thinking. Each major wave was planned with attention to fighter escort, diversionary tactics, and attempts to concentrate attacks against specific high-value targets or vulnerable sectors of the fleet. The Japanese military allocated its remaining fighter aircraft to provide escort for kamikaze formations, attempting to keep defensive American fighters engaged while slower, bomb-carrying aircraft pressed toward their targets. Japanese planners recognized that the destruction of transport ships and fleet-trained vessels would cripple American offensive capacity even more effectively than sinking combat ships. Accordingly, Japanese pilots attacked landing ships, cargo vessels, and ammunition ships with particular focus, recognizing that destroying supply capacity could have cascading effects on American ground operations. The US-LEST 861, the USS Henrico, the USS Dickerson, and numerous other cargo and transport vessels were struck and damaged or sunk during the campaign. Each loss or damage represented not just materiel destruction, but also a reduction in the capacity to supply American ground forces. American defense against the kamikaze threat evolved continuously throughout the campaign, representing an adaptation that demonstrated the flexibility of American naval warfare doctrine. Early in the campaign, American commanders recognized that conventional fighter tactics and anti-aircraft gunnery, while effective, could not achieve perfect interception rates against determined attackers. Accordingly, American fleet commanders adjusted defensive formation, concentrating defensive firepower around the most valuable ships and accepting greater risk for less critical vessels. American fighter directors improved the coordination between radar-guided fighter vectors and visual intercept, increasing the number of Japanese aircraft destroyed before they could reach the fleet. Anti-aircraft gunners trained continuously, working to achieve faster target acquisition and more accurate fire, despite the challenge of tracking fast-moving aircraft. American damage control parties developed procedures and trained extensively in fire suppression and damage containment that allowed ships to survive hits that might have been fatal to vessels lacking such preparation. These responses accumulated into a defensive system that, while imperfect, became increasingly effective as the campaign continued. Yet the American improvements in defense did not eliminate kamikaze threat, and losses continued throughout the campaign. The destroyer USS Pritchett was struck in mid-May, suffering casualties and damage that required days in repair. The destroyer USS Reuben James was struck late in May in an attack that killed or wounded significant numbers of her crew. The fast transport USS Dickerson was sunk in a kamikaze attack that occurred late in the campaign, representing one of the few sinkings of larger vessels by kamikaze attack. The cumulative effect of these strikes was to create a continuous drain on American naval resources, with ships rotating to rear areas for repair, reducing the number of vessels available for fleet operations and fire support. The United States Navy, despite its material superiority and defensive advantages, found itself unable to achieve the kind of protection that American commanders and sailors desired. The war at sea had taken on a dimension that naval warfare in the 20th century had not previously required, an enemy that could not be deterred or suppressed by conventional means, an opponent that voluntarily sacrificed himself and his aircraft to achieve contact with the enemy. The impact of kamikaze operations on American naval morale and psychology proved significant even when the material damage was limited. Sailors who survived kamikaze attacks or who served on ships in areas where such attacks were likely described the experience as qualitatively different from other forms of combat. The knowledge that an enemy pilot intended to crash directly into your ship, that the aircraft itself was the weapon, and that defensive fire could not guarantee interception, created a form of psychological pressure distinct from conventional naval combat. American sailors developed a respect for Japanese pilots based partly on understanding their commitment and partly on fear of the tactics they employed. The cumulative effect of sustained kamikaze attacks, even when most aircraft were successfully intercepted, was to create an undercurrent of anxiety among the American fleet that persisted throughout the campaign. Letters home from sailors frequently mentioned the intensity of air attacks and the novel form of threat that kamikaze represented. Veterans in post-war interviews consistently identified kamikaze operations as one of the most memorable and challenging aspects of their naval service. Despite the psychological impact and material damage inflicted by kamikaze operations, the campaign failed to achieve its strategic objectives. The fundamental problem that Japan faced was not new. The American industrial capacity and logistical system, while vulnerable to attack, could absorb losses and continue functioning. Ships damaged in kamikaze attacks could be repaired in American shipyards thousands of kilometers away from combat. Replacement vessels could be rapidly dispatched from America to compensate for losses. Even as Japanese pilots achieved hits on American ships, American shipyards were producing new vessels at rates that far exceeded Japanese destruction. The American fleet, despite sustaining damage and casualties, never experienced the operational breakdown that Japanese planners had anticipated. Supply to American ground forces continued, reinforcements arrived, and the flow of ammunition and materiel never diminished to the point where ground operations were constrained. This fundamental mismatch between Japanese capability and American capacity meant that kamikaze operations, for all their audacity and sacrifice, could not achieve the effect that Japanese planners desired. The 10 major waves of Operation Kikusui consumed the remaining organized air strength of the Japanese military in the Okinawa area and beyond. By June, when the final major kamikaze operations ceased, Japan's air forces had been devastated by attrition, losses in combat with American fighters, and exhaustion of fuel and ammunition supplies. The pilots who died in these attacks represented some of the most experienced and trained aircrew that Japan possessed, irreplaceable losses that further degraded Japanese military capacity. The message that kamikaze operations sent to the American military was clear. Japan would continue fighting regardless of material disadvantage, regardless of casualty rates, regardless of strategic reality. This message, far from weakening American resolve, actually hardened American determination to end the war as quickly as possible through whatever means necessary. The knowledge that Japan would continue fighting even in the face of catastrophic military disadvantage influenced American strategic thinking regarding the atomic bombs and the final Japanese surrender in August of 1945. The relationship between the kamikaze campaign and the ground battle on Okinawa was direct and consequential. American sailors, facing relentless air attacks, developed a fierce appreciation for the vulnerability of their position and the determination of the Japanese enemy. This experience reinforced the view among American commanders that Japanese resistance would not collapse quickly or without extraordinary cost. The naval air campaign served to prove that Japan would not surrender, that casualties would continue to mount, and that conventional military operations, however successful tactically, would not break Japanese resistance quickly. The war at sea during the Okinawa campaign thus influenced the calculus of American strategic decision-making at the highest levels, contributing to the context in which the atomic bomb decision would eventually be made. The kamikaze pilots who died attacking the American fleet achieved no material breakthrough, sank no critical number of ships, and failed to compel American retreat or operational pause. Yet their sacrifice demonstrated a truth that American military planners had to accept. Victory over Japan would require not merely conventional military success, but a fundamental collapse of Japanese willingness to continue fighting. a collapse that conventional military operations alone could not guarantee. The opening weeks of the Battle of Okinawa had taught American commanders a bitter lesson in adaptation. The old playbook of broad frontal assaults and relentless pressure across the entire line had yielded nothing but mounting casualty lists and stalled progress. What worked at Iwo Jima or in island-hopping campaigns across the Pacific had collided with something different here. A fortress that had been built not in a single defensive line, but in depth, with each strongpoint constructed to mutually support its neighbors, with every cave and bunker designed to extract maximum American blood for every meter of ground surrendered. By late May, after weeks of grinding warfare that had exhausted both armies but left the Japanese still fighting, American field commanders began to recognize that their own methods needed to evolve. What emerged was not a sudden revelation, but a gradual shift in how American firepower and infantry were coordinated, how strongpoints were isolated and destroyed, and how the overwhelming material advantages the United States possessed could be brought to bear against a defensive system that had been built to absorb conventional assault. The key to this tactical evolution lay in concentration. Rather than spreading American attacks across broad frontages that diffused their striking power and allowed Japanese defenders to shift reserves between threatened sectors, American commanders began to identify specific strongpoints, isolate them from mutual support, and bring everything available to bear against them in sequence. This meant that an American general would identify a fortified position that was particularly critical to Japanese defense, would then concentrate artillery from multiple batteries against that single objective, would coordinate naval gunfire from ships anchored offshore to strike from another direction, and would bring in fighter bombers to make passes at precisely the right moment. Only after this hammer of firepower had broken the Japanese position would infantry assault troops move forward to finish the job and clear the ruins. The Japanese, by contrast, had worked within a system of distributed defense, where each strongpoint was expected to hold as long as possible, while supporting strongpoints continued to fight. American adaptation meant attacking the system itself rather than trying to defeat it head-on. The change in approach reflected a hard-won understanding of how Japanese defensive doctrine actually functioned. Early American attacks had assumed that if enough pressure was brought against the Japanese line at enough points, that line would eventually break. What American commanders gradually learned was that the Japanese defensive position was less a line than it was a network of strong points, each capable of independent defense, each positioned to cover ground that would be difficult to traverse. Breaking through one point often meant that Japanese forces could still defend the next point, and the next, and the next. The solution was to identify the strong points that were most critical to the overall system, and to break them, forcing the Japanese to either commit reserves to restore the line or accept the consequences of a collapse in one sector. American commanders like General Simon Bolivar Buckner and his corps commanders began to study maps more carefully, to gather intelligence about Japanese positions with more precision, and to plan their assaults with the kind of methodical preparation that characterized operations against fortified positions rather than hastily organized efforts to achieve breakthrough. The coordination of supporting arms became the engine of American success in this new approach. Where earlier in the campaign American artillery might have provided general suppressive fire across a broad area, now it was tasked with specific missions against identified Japanese positions. Observation posts would radio back information about Japanese gun flashes, about smoke rising from cave entrances, about the movement of Japanese soldiers in areas where they thought themselves concealed. This information was processed quickly, either by forward observers who would call down fire, or by artillery fire direction centers, where officers calculated trajectories and coordinated the efforts of multiple batteries to converge on the same target. Naval gunfire support, provided by destroyers and cruisers anchored offshore, added another layer of firepower that could be directed at targets that were beyond the range of field artillery, or that required the destructive power of larger caliber weapons. The Navy gunfire spotters, positioned with American infantry units, could direct fire from these ships with remarkable precision, and the 5-inch and 6-inch shells from naval guns would tear apart Japanese fortifications with force that no field piece could match. Close air support evolved in parallel. American fighter bombers, initially used for broader missions of air superiority and harassment, were increasingly tasked with precision strikes against identified strongpoints. A forward air controller, equipped with a radio and positioned with an infantry unit, could call for air support and direct the pilots of waiting aircraft to specific targets with enough accuracy that a fighter bomber making a low pass with rockets or machine guns could hit a Japanese bunker or cave entrance that posed a critical threat to the infantry below. The coordination between ground and air was not always perfect, and there were instances of friendly fire incidents that caused American casualties, but the general trend was toward tighter integration. A Japanese strongpoint that might have been difficult for infantry to assault directly could be pummeled from above, could be hit by naval gunfire, and could be suppressed by artillery all in sequence, reducing the strength of the Japanese defense before American soldiers had to close and finish the job. The process of isolating a strongpoint became a science unto itself. Once American intelligence had identified a particular position as critical to Japanese defense, American forces would work to cut it off from reinforcement or resupply. If a Japanese strongpoint held a hill, American forces would move to occupy the surrounding terrain, preventing Japanese reserves from moving forward to strengthen the position. Artillery would be positioned to interdict avenues of approach, ensuring that any Japanese attempt to move troops or supplies toward the threatened strongpoint would meet withering fire. Only then would the actual assault begin, and by that point the Japanese defenders were not reinforcing a strongpoint, but rather defending an increasingly isolated position with whatever ammunition and supplies they had at hand. The attrition worked in America's favor. The Japanese had finite supplies of ammunition and food, while American forces had the capacity to replace losses and resupply from the vast logistics network that extended back to American bases and ultimately to American industry. American artillery served as the foundation of this new approach. The United States had deployed enormous quantities of field artillery to Okinawa, dozens and dozens of batteries of 75mm guns, 105mm guns, and larger weapons positioned across the island. These guns could be concentrated against specific targets, could deliver fire with remarkable speed once a target was identified, and could maintain a rate of fire that Japanese artillery, already short of ammunition, could not match. American artillery officers developed procedures for rapid-fire missions where a battery could move from firing one target to firing another in a matter of minutes. The sound of American artillery became a constant feature of the battlefield, a drumming that marked American control of the physical space, even in areas where fighting continued. Japanese soldiers, sheltered in caves and bunkers, could listen to this endless bombardment and understand that American firepower was being brought to bear with a precision and concentration they could not counter. The shift in tactics meant that American infantry, rather than making repeated costly assaults against prepared positions, increasingly fought battles where the enemy had already been softened by hours or days of bombardment. A Japanese strongpoint that had been pounded by artillery and naval gunfire would be less capable of sustained resistance when American infantry finally advanced. Machine gun positions might be buried under rubble or abandoned as Japanese defenders fell back to secondary positions. The infantry assault, when it came, would still be dangerous and would still result in casualties, but the outcome was more predictable, the resistance less coordinated, the likelihood of success greater. American infantry learned to work closely with artillery and air support, to time their advances for moments when supporting fire could be brought to bear, and to advance as far as fire superiority allowed before consolidating gains and preparing for the next phase of the operation. Individual American units began to develop a kind of tactical flexibility that had not been as pronounced earlier in the campaign. A company commander, after observing that a frontal assault against a Japanese position would result in heavy losses, might instead maneuver his unit to approach from a flank or from the rear, might coordinate with adjacent units to assault multiple positions simultaneously, or might request that artillery fire be redirected to hit a bunker that was holding up the advance. Battalion and regimental commanders became skilled at identifying which strongpoints could be isolated and attacked in sequence, which required more powerful support before assault was feasible, and how to concentrate their forces where they could achieve superiority. The Japanese, meanwhile, were fighting with increasingly depleted forces, with ammunition that had to be carefully rationed, and with a command structure that was becoming progressively more difficult to maintain as American forces compressed them into smaller and smaller areas. The breakthrough in the American tactical approach was not a single moment, but a series of small adjustments that accumulated into a different way of fighting. By early June, the pattern was clear. American forces would identify a critical Japanese strongpoint, would concentrate firepower against it from multiple sources until Japanese resistance weakened significantly, would assault with infantry to take the position, and would consolidate and prepare for the next strongpoint. The Japanese defensive line was being peeled apart, not at once, but sector by sector, strongpoint by strongpoint. The Shuri line, which had seemed so formidable in early May, was collapsing not because American infantry had finally managed some dramatic breakthrough, but because American commanders had learned to use their material advantages with precision and coordination. Each strongpoint that fell made the Japanese position less tenable, forced Japanese reserves to be committed to restore or stabilize the line, and gradually eroded the Japanese capacity to continue defending. The human cost of this shift was still enormous. American soldiers still died taking these positions, still faced Japanese defenders who would fight to the end rather than surrender, still encountered booby traps and surprises as they advanced. But the new approach meant fewer American casualties than the earlier frontal assaults had produced, a gradual but steady progress toward Japanese positions, and a progressive reduction in Japanese combat strength. By the second week of June, the Shuri line, which had held American forces at bay for weeks, was no longer a continuous defensive line, but a series of disconnected strongpoints that Japanese forces were fighting to maintain with increasingly desperate measures. American firepower and American tactical adaptation were grinding away at Japanese resistance, not through any brilliant maneuver or sudden assault, but through the relentless application of superior resources in a coordinated way. The Japanese had prepared for a conventional assault and had prepared their defenses to resist it. What they faced instead was an enemy that had adapted, that had learned from their experience, and that was now using their overwhelming advantages with precision and method, rather than with blunt force alone. By late May, the arithmetic of defeat had become unavoidable. The Shuri defensive line, which had held American forces at bay for 3 grueling weeks, was beginning to collapse under the weight of coordinated assault and relentless bombardment. American forces had methodically reduced Japanese strongpoints through a combination of concentrated artillery fire, infantry assault, and naval gunfire support that continued to pour destruction onto the island. The Japanese had lost tens of thousands of soldiers in the defense of their fortified positions, yet American casualties mounted as well, measured in the hundreds each day. General Ushijima, observing that his defensive depth was exhausted and that American forces were beginning to penetrate his lines at multiple points, faced a stark choice: attempt further counterattacks that would waste the last of his reserves, or execute a fighting withdrawal to preserve his remaining forces and continue the campaign from a more defensible position. He chose the latter, though not without acrimony toward Colonel Yahara, whose consistent advocacy for defense through attrition had now given way to the logistics of survival. The Kion Peninsula, a narrow projection of land at the southern tip of Okinawa, became the objective for this withdrawal. It was not a position of strength, but rather a position of last resort, a place where terrain offered some defensive advantage and where geography itself, the surrounding sea, would eventually contain the battle in a way that suited the Japanese intention to fight to the end. The challenge, however, was not merely reaching the peninsula, but doing so while maintaining order, preserving enough military coherence to establish a new line, and preventing American forces from shattering the retreating columns into scattered fragments. A retreat, particularly one executed under pressure, carries inherent risks. Units become separated, communications fail, discipline erodes, and pursuing enemy forces exploit every gap in the withdrawing formation. Ushijima understood these dangers, as did Yahara, yet both recognized that standing fast against the American assault would result only in encirclement and annihilation within days rather than weeks. The decision to withdraw represented not acceptance of defeat, but rather a strategic calculation that preserving mobile force was more valuable than holding ground that could no longer be defended. The actual execution of the withdrawal began in stages, a choreography of movement that required coordination across multiple Japanese divisions and independent units spread across a collapsing front. Japanese forces occupying the center and eastern sectors of the Shuri Line were ordered to disengage under cover of darkness and organize delaying actions, moving southward through terrain they had previously fortified. Units moved along established routes, carrying what supplies and ammunition remained, though shortages were severe and becoming more acute each day. The Japanese had suffered not only personnel losses but also devastating attrition among their transport capacity. Vehicles had been destroyed or rendered unusable, animals had been expended, and supply depots had been either captured or rendered inaccessible by American bombardment. This meant that much of the equipment that divisions had brought to Okinawa had to be abandoned or destroyed to prevent capture. The sight of Japanese soldiers destroying their own artillery pieces, vehicles, and ammunition depots represented a tangible manifestation of the narrowing options available to Ushijima's command. They could neither hold territory nor maintain logistical support sufficient for sustained defense. American forces, sensing the shift in Japanese deployment, pressed forward with accelerating momentum, though pursuit was not without friction and delay. Pursuing an enemy in withdrawal presents its own tactical challenges, as broken terrain can conceal ambushes, exhausted troops move more slowly than units with sustained energy, and commanders must balance forward momentum against the risk of being drawn into a trap. Japanese rearguard detachments, positioned along the main avenues of withdrawal, inflicted casualties on American advance elements and slowed the pursuit, buying time for larger formations to establish positions further south. These rearguard actions were often suicidal in character. Small groups of Japanese soldiers armed with grenades, mines, and small arms would establish ambushes in terrain where they had previously prepared defensive positions, launching attacks on American patrols and infantry platoons, knowing that their withdrawal would only delay the inevitable. American forces responding to these ambushes suffered casualties but generally had sufficient reserves and firepower to suppress the Japanese defensive positions and continue their advance. The overall effect was a gradual American compression of the Japanese forces toward the peninsula, though not the catastrophic encirclement and destruction that American commanders were hoping to achieve. The psychological weight of the retreat, for Japanese soldiers and officers, could not be measured in tactical terms alone. For an army whose entire doctrine was built on honor through offensive action, whose soldiers had been indoctrinated with the concept that retreat was shameful, and whose officer class had internalized the imperial mythology that the Japanese race was destined to prevail, the reality of pulling back in the face of enemy pressure represented a profound rupture with established cultural meaning. Some units maintained discipline and executed the withdrawal in organized fashion, while others experienced breakdown. Soldiers became separated from their units, command authority fragmented, and the coherence that had previously characterized even badly damaged formations dissolved into chaos at the margins. Japanese officers responded to these breakdowns with severity, executing soldiers accused of desertion or cowardice, though such measures could not restore what had already been lost through attrition and the accumulation of defeats. The transformation from fortress garrison to retreating army represented not merely a tactical shift, but a cultural trauma, a moment in which the essential myth upon which the entire military structure had been constructed collided with irreconcilable reality. Civilians caught in the path of the withdrawal experienced this chaos with more immediate and devastating consequences than did organized military units. Okinawan civilians had been incorporated into the Japanese military apparatus throughout the campaign, serving as laborers, supply carriers, and auxiliary combatants, drawn into the logic of military necessity and Japanese racial ideology that positioned them as extensions of the imperial will. As Japanese forces withdrew, some civilians were ordered to move with the military columns, expected to continue their support roles in the new defensive line, while others were left behind or abandoned in villages that American forces were rapidly overrunning. The evacuation of civilian areas behind the Japanese lines had never occurred, leaving the population integrated throughout the battle zone with no viable options for escape or protection. Japanese military authorities offered no sanctuary, no evacuation assistance, no guidance on how civilians might achieve safety, and in some cases, actively prevented civilian movement southward, fearful that refugee columns might interfere with military operations. Families that had survived earlier stages of the campaign now faced the prospect of being trapped between advancing American forces and retreating Japanese formations, with neither army offering protection or assistance. The supply situation, already critical before the Shuri line collapsed, became catastrophic during the retreat. Japanese forces on Okinawa had arrived with limited supplies relative to the scale of the campaign, had suffered repeated losses in supply ships sunk by American air and submarine attack, and had been forced to rely on local requisitions and captured American supplies for much of what they consumed. The weeks of defensive battle had depleted ammunition stores to the point where many units were severely rationed, with soldiers and officers aware that the supply of bullets and artillery rounds was finite and approaching exhaustion. Japanese artillery, which had proven surprisingly effective in the early stages of the Shuri defense, began to fall silent as ammunition became unavailable, ceding the artillery advantage entirely to American forces. Food became scarce, with soldiers surviving on reduced rations and sometimes nothing more than what could be foraged or taken from civilian stocks. Medical supplies had been exhausted or destroyed, and wounded soldiers who could not walk were left behind, either to be captured or to die of their wounds. The logistical collapse was not a sudden event, but rather the final stage of a progressive degradation that had begun the moment American air superiority had been achieved weeks earlier. Japanese command decisions during the withdrawal revealed the deepening fissures between Ushijima and Yahara, between the impulse toward aggressive action and the cold calculus of military mathematics. Ushijima, driven by the shame of retreat and by pressure from higher command in Tokyo to continue fighting, wanted to establish a new defensive line as rapidly as possible and prepare counterattacks against the advancing Americans. Yahara, by contrast, advocated for dispersal of forces into the rugged terrain of the peninsula, a shift from concentrated linear defense to distributed defensive positions that would be more difficult for American forces to suppress through mass firepower. The two officers had disagreed before, but those disagreements had occurred within a framework where both understood the fundamental strategy: impose maximum casualties on the American advance while eventually being defeated. Now, with the campaign approaching its terminal phase, the disagreement took on a sharper edge, each officer understanding that the decisions made in these final weeks would determine not whether Japan would lose the battle, but how that loss would be suffered and what legacy would remain. The courtesy that had characterized their prior disputes showed signs of strain as exhaustion, stress, and recognition of inevitable catastrophe weighed on both men. The peninsula itself offered little advantage beyond geography, and the fact that its narrow dimensions would eventually prevent American forces from maneuvering freely around Japanese positions. The terrain was broken and hilly, offering natural positions for defense, and the civilians and soldiers who had previously occupied that region had already fortified many locations in anticipation of a Japanese withdrawal. However, the peninsula was smaller than the main Shuri defensive zone, meaning that the density of forces compressed into the remaining territory would be even higher, presenting concentrated targets for American artillery and air support. Supply routes were limited, effectively single roads that American forces could easily interdict or monitor, meaning that resupply would become progressively more difficult and eventually impossible. Japanese command, in ordering the retreat to the peninsula, was essentially accepting a situation where they would be slowly compressed into an increasingly smaller pocket of territory until either American forces overran them completely or lack of supplies and ammunition made further resistance impossible. The retreat was not a prelude to renewal, but rather an orderly transition into the final stage of the campaign, one where the outcome was already determined, but where the script had not yet been fully written. By early June, the Japanese forces had established themselves in the Keihan Peninsula, occupying positions in caves and fortified locations throughout the terrain, their ranks thinned by weeks of combat, and their supplies reduced to whatever could be carried by retreating soldiers. The American pursuit, though energetic, had necessarily slowed as supply lines were extended and American forces had to consolidate around newly captured air bases and supply dumps. The pause, brief though it would prove to be, allowed Ushijima to organize his remaining forces and prepare psychological defenses against the final assault that he knew was coming. Japanese soldiers dug into prepared positions with the understanding that they would likely die in place, that surrender was not an option offered or accepted, and that the only remaining question was how many Americans they could kill before their ammunition ran out and their positions were overrun. The retreat had compressed them geographically, but had not defeated them militarily, a distinction that mattered to men who had been raised to believe that physical survival was less important than the manner in which one accepted death. The final chapter of the battle had not yet begun, but all of its participants, American and Japanese alike, recognized that the crescendo was approaching. The retreat itself had cost the Japanese forces heavily, both in soldiers lost to American pursuit and in the equipment and supplies that had to be abandoned or destroyed. Yet it had also preserved military structure and command authority at a moment when complete collapse might have occurred. American forces had pressed the retreating Japanese formations hard, inflicting casualties through air attack, artillery bombardment, and ground engagement, but had not managed to achieve the decisive breakthrough that would have severed the peninsula from the main island or trapped large Japanese formations against the sea. The Japanese had executed an orderly withdrawal despite their inferiority in every form of firepower and their exhaustion from weeks of continuous combat. In doing so, they had preserved the possibility of continued resistance, even as they had conceded ground and acknowledged that the broader strategic situation was beyond recovery. The retreat transformed the battle from a spatial conflict, where territory and terrain dominated the tactical calculation, into a temporal one, where time itself became the crucial variable, and the question was not whether Japan would lose, but when the final act would conclude, and how many lives would be consumed before it did. By late May, the geography of survival on Okinawa had shrunk to a narrow corridor of southern coastline. The American offensive, relentless and methodical, had compressed Japanese military forces into the Keihan Peninsula, a fingertip of land jutting into the East China Sea. What had begun 90 days earlier as a sprawling defensive network across half an island had contracted into a final killing ground barely 10 kilometers wide. Within this shrinking perimeter, something more tragic than the collision of armies was unfolding. Approximately 120,000 Okinawan civilians who had not fled or died in the earlier phases of the battle now found themselves trapped between two militaries, one collapsing, the other advancing with systematic firepower. They were civilians in name only, stripped of any meaningful protection, and regarded by the Japanese military command as expendable reserves in a battle already lost. The Japanese garrison had incorporated the civilian population into the machinery of war from the moment they arrived on Okinawa. Families were conscripted into service as stretcher bearers, ammunition carriers, and fortification laborers. Young women and girls were organized into nursing units, though these roles offered no safety and sometimes exposed them to direct combat. The elderly, the infirm, and the very young were deemed less valuable but still pressed into whatever utility they could provide. This was not conquest in any traditional sense, but something closer to siege warfare, where the surrounding population became part of the defensive infrastructure. The Japanese commanders understood that civilians moved supplies, filled gaps in the lines, and provided the sheer mass that forced American forces to engage in close combat, rather than rely entirely on artillery. Their presence, in military terms, was a force multiplier. In human terms, it was a sentence of death. Crucially, the Japanese military had conducted a propaganda campaign among the Okinawan population that poisoned the possibility of surrender long before the final phase began. Leaflets and persistent rumors had warned civilians of American brutality, describing rape, mutilation, and slow death at the hands of American soldiers. These narratives were partly rooted in genuine atrocities committed by Japanese forces elsewhere in the Pacific, where American prisoners had been mistreated, and partly pure fabrication designed to steal resolve. But the psychological effect was devastating. Families came to believe that surrender meant unspeakable horrors for their women and daughters. Death, by this logic, became preferable to capture. As the military situation deteriorated and Japanese control fragmented across the peninsula, this propaganda machinery had already done its corrosive work on the minds of thousands of civilians. They believed they faced a choice between two forms of extinction, and many concluded that death under their own control was the more honorable path. The American bombardment of the final zones intensified as May turned toward June. Artillery batteries, positioned miles away, could not distinguish between Japanese military positions and civilian shelters. Naval guns from ships offshore added their weight to the fire mission. Aircraft dropped ordnance on suspected strongpoints without knowledge of who sheltered beneath the rubble and stone. The civilians who had sought refuge in the network of caves that honeycombed the southern peninsula lived in perpetual darkness, punctuated by explosion and collapse. Parents held children as walls trembled. The smell of cordite mixed with human waste and decomposing bodies. There was no distinction between civilian space and military space anymore. The caves that harbored Japanese ammunition stores also harbored families. The bunkers that protected Japanese command posts also contained women and children waiting for the bombardment to cease. From an American fire support perspective, these were legitimate targets. From the perspective of the people trapped within them, they were tombs that refused to accept their final occupants quietly. Japanese military authorities, aware that their situation was hopeless, made a fateful choice about how to regard the civilian population in these final days. Instead of encouraging evacuation or surrender, senior officers and enlisted men actively discouraged civilians from leaving the defensive zones. Some commanders issued explicit orders forbidding civilians from moving toward American lines. Others spread rumors that American soldiers were slaughtering any Japanese they encountered, military or civilian. In some cases, Japanese soldiers physically prevented families from leaving caves, forcing them to remain in spaces that provided neither safety nor hope. There is no evidence of a single, centralized order from Ushijima's headquarters mandating civilian suicide, but the atmosphere created by military authority made clear that surrender was shameful and that death alongside the military was the expected outcome. The psychological violence was as effective as any physical coercion. Mothers and fathers came to believe they were protecting their children by ending their lives rather than allowing capture. The first wave of mass civilian deaths occurred in late May when American forces broke through positions near Shuri and began advancing into the civilian population centers. Entire families, receiving no accurate information about the military situation and believing propaganda about American intentions, chose death together in caves and bunkers. Some accounts describe Japanese soldiers distributing grenades to civilians or providing poison in the final hours. Other accounts describe soldiers shooting civilians who refuse to commit suicide, though the distinction between coercion and choice becomes meaningless under such circumstances. What is clear is that the pattern was widespread enough to shock American soldiers encountering the bodies. Young Marines who had steeled themselves for combat found scenes of mass death, families huddled together in the dark, their lives ended not by shells and bullets, but by deliberate choice under military pressure and propaganda. The psychological impact on American troops was profound. They had trained to defeat an enemy. They had not trained to witness the systematic destruction of an entire civilian population by their own bombardment and the enemy's psychological manipulation combined. As the Kian Peninsula became the final refuge, the compression of forces meant that civilian and military casualties merged into a single catastrophe. Japanese artillery positions that were positioned to defend against American advances were also positioned directly adjacent to the densest civilian concentrations. When American counter-battery fire and direct assault destroyed these positions, the resulting explosions killed indiscriminately. When Japanese soldiers made their last stands in bunkers, civilians sheltering nearby died when those positions were overrun or demolished. American forces, advancing through terrain they could barely see and could not safely map, occasionally shelled areas without full understanding of civilian presence, compounding the tragedy. The scale of civilian death accelerated exponentially in the final 2 weeks of organized Japanese resistance. Entire villages, entire family groups, entire networks of refugees who had clung to life through 11 weeks of warfare simply ceased to exist, their presence erased in the chaos of a military collapse. The response from Okinawan survivors reflected the profound trauma of that experience. Some families successfully made their way through the lines to American positions, though many were shot at by Japanese soldiers during the attempt. Others emerged from caves days or weeks after the main battle ended, weakened by hunger and shock, unable initially to comprehend that the fighting had actually ceased. The cultural rupture was complete. Families had been promised that surrender meant horror, that American soldiers were monsters, that death was the proper response to defeat. Instead, the survivors encountered a different reality. American soldiers, themselves traumatized and exhausted, who in many cases provided food, water, and medical care. The gap between propaganda and reality was vast enough to shatter worldviews that had been constructed over months of military occupation. Some survivors experienced profound guilt that they had not died as military authorities suggested they should. Others felt a bitter recognition that they had been deliberately sacrificed in a military gamble that was always destined to fail. The casual brutality of the decisions made by Japanese command became clearer in retrospect. General Ushijima and his staff had calculated that the longer they could maintain resistance, the higher the American casualties would be, and that high American casualties might somehow convince Washington to negotiate rather than invade the home islands. It was a desperate calculation based on the assumption that American political will would break if the costs became high enough. Civilian lives were entered into that equation as expendable currency. Officers knew that civilians were being killed by American bombardment. They knew that civilians were choosing suicide rather than surrender. They possessed the authority to change this outcome, to order evacuation or allow surrender. Instead, they maintained the pressure on civilians to stay in the defensive zones, to die alongside soldiers, to accept military values as the proper response to military defeat. This was not a necessary consequence of military defeat. It was a choice, made repeatedly, to prioritize the military's honor over the survival of the population it claimed to protect. The political aftermath of Okinawa transformed how the wider Japanese population understood the war. Reports of civilian deaths, particularly the mass suicides, reached Japan through survivors and rumors. The fact that civilians had been trapped, that Japanese military authorities had encouraged mass death, that the military had treated its own population as expendable in a lost cause, created a fracture in Japanese public consciousness that would never fully heal. The narrative that the military was protecting Japan from American invasion became harder to believe when the military's actions on Okinawa suggested that protection meant willing the civilian population toward death. For the millions of Japanese citizens still living on the home islands, still believing in the possibility of a glorious stand against invasion, the reality of what had happened on Okinawa offered a glimpse of what their own civilian experience might entail if the war continued. The propaganda that had worked so effectively on Okinawa would be recycled and deployed again in the final months before surrender. But the knowledge that civilians had been sacrificed, that military authorities had encouraged mass suicide rather than accept defeat with honor, had planted seeds of doubt in the broader population. The American interpretation of what had occurred on Okinawa influenced strategic thinking about the home islands. Military planners, witnessing the scale of civilian death on Okinawa and recognizing that the Japanese population would be even more densely concentrated on Honshu and Kyushu, began to calculate that an invasion of the home islands could produce casualties in the millions, both military and civilian. The fact that Japanese civilians were willing to choose death over surrender, that military authorities were encouraging this outcome, suggested that no amount of tactical victory would bring an end to the war, as long as Japanese society continued to view military defeat as a fate worse than collective death. This calculation, combined with the military's assessment that Japan had no hope of military victory but remained committed to fighting to the last person, created the conditions that would lead military planners to consider alternatives to invasion. The tragedy on Okinawa, in other words, became part of the logical chain that led to the atomic bombing decision. The civilian deaths were not incidental to American strategy. They were central to how American strategists came to view the necessity of ending the war through means other than invasion. By the end of May, the final defensive positions on Okinawa were little more than rubble and caves filled with the dying. Japanese military strength had been reduced to scattered units, many without ammunition, most without contact with higher command. The civilian population that remained alive was traumatized and desperate, pressed into an ever smaller space where bombardment from American guns was literally constant. The military situation was irretrievable. General Ushijima and his staff recognized this reality in their command posts. Yet the orders continued, the resistance continued, the refusal to allow surrender continued. The civilians in the caves and bunkers waited for the end, wondering if they would live to see a different outcome, or if the choice that had been pressed upon them by military authority would ultimately define their fate. The battle on Okinawa was no longer a contest between armies. It had become a catastrophe of forced choice, where civilians trapped in the final defensive zone had been taught to believe that death was more honorable than survival, and where that belief, ruthlessly encouraged by their own military authorities, would shape the final weeks of the battle and claim tens of thousands of lives that had nothing to do with military strategy and everything to do with the intersection of propaganda, honor, and desperation. By the third week of June 1945, the Okinawan campaign had transformed into something neither side had fully anticipated. What had begun as a controlled defensive battle had devolved into a desperate scramble for survival, a collapsing system of command and control where Japanese officers found themselves governing not an army, but fragments of broken units scattered across shrinking terrain. General Ushijima's headquarters, once positioned at Shuri with reasonable access to forward positions and lateral communication, had been forced to relocate multiple times as American forces methodically compressed the Japanese perimeter. The infrastructure that had supported organized military operations for months had simply ceased to function. Telephone lines connecting divisional commands to regiment, regiment to battalion, and battalion to company had been cut by artillery fire or overrun by advancing Americans. What remained was a patchwork of runners on foot, many of whom never arrived at their destinations, and radio operators whose signals were increasingly jammed or intercepted by American intelligence. The fog of war, that ancient condition where commanders operate on incomplete information and desperate assumptions, had consumed the Japanese command entirely. Supply lines, always precarious since the opening weeks of the campaign, had now evaporated into abstraction. There were no supply lines anymore. There was only the fact that ammunition was running critically low, that food had become a theoretical concept rather than a daily reality, and that medical supplies had reached a condition of such scarcity that field surgeons made decisions about who might live, based not on the severity of wounds, but on the likelihood of a given soldier returning to combat. The careful calculations that Colonel Yahara had made during the defensive phase, preserving ammunition for maximum attrition, spacing out artillery barrages to stretch dwindling stocks, had become irrelevant exercises. Guns fell silent not because commanders ordered them silent, but because there were no more shells to fire. Japanese soldiers drank stagnant water from bomb craters and ate whatever vegetation remained on the blackened landscape. Some officers understood that the battle was materially over, that the only question remaining was how many additional casualties they could inflict before the complete annihilation of their force. Others seemed unable to accept this reality, clinging to the possibility that some countermeasure, some unexpected turn in the broader strategic situation, might yet reverse the inevitable. The compression of Japanese forces into the Kian Peninsula created a situation of almost surreal chaos. Tens of thousands of surviving soldiers, along with an unknown number of civilians trapped in the same shrinking pocket, were packed into an area that grew smaller by the hour. Artillery fire from American guns positioned across the island found targets almost at random. The sheer density of Japanese troops and refugees made precision unnecessary. American infantry, advancing methodically from the north and east, encountered resistance that had become less coordinated and more frantic. The desperate actions of isolated units fighting with no knowledge of what other units were doing or where the overall front lines had stabilized. Japanese soldiers would defend a position, hold it against assault, and then find themselves surrounded as American forces maneuvered around their flanks. Maneuvers they could not counter because communication with other units had simply broken down. The experience of command, once involving strategic calculation and tactical oversight, had reduced itself to immediate, visceral decisions made by men with fragmentary information who understood only that they should hold where they stood until ordered to move, and when orders did arrive, they could not be certain those orders came from legitimate authority or when they had been issued. General Ushijima, sequestered in his headquarters cave at the southern tip of the peninsula, had become increasingly isolated from the actual conduct of the battle. Japanese command tradition and the rigid hierarchies of the Imperial Japanese Army meant that he could not simply walk forward to observe positions or confer directly with forward commanders. Information flowed upward through channels that no longer existed with any reliability, and orders flowed downward into a void where they were received by some units and never reached others. Ushijima had made the significant decision to order the withdrawal from the Shuri line and the retreat southward, a tactical step that bought time but consumed the last operational reserves. He continued to receive reports, some accurate, most wildly distorted, about the American positions, American strength, and the condition of his own forces. Some of these reports spoke of counterattack opportunities that did not exist, of American supply difficulties that were minor inconveniences rather than genuine vulnerabilities, of Japanese units still operating at near full strength when most were reduced to a fraction of authorized personnel. Officers and staff members, sensing their commander's preference for aggressive action and unwilling to deliver entirely accurate reports of dissolution and disintegration, filtered information through layers of optimism that bore almost no relationship to ground truth. The American assault on the Japanese positions evolved into a series of local actions that, taken together, comprised the destruction of Ushijima's remaining military force. American commanders had shifted away from the massive frontal attacks of earlier weeks and adopted instead a strategy of deliberate, concentrated assaults on specific strongpoints, supported by overwhelming firepower that Japanese forces could not effectively counter or evade. Artillery preparation would precede the assault, pulverizing known defensive positions with thousands of rounds. Naval gunfire from offshore would target specific ridgelines and elevations. Close air support would strafe and bomb identified troop concentrations. Then infantry would move forward, often in relatively small groups, clearing caves and bunkers and fortified positions through a combination of grenades, flamethrowers, and small unit tactics, refined through months of island fighting. Each position conquered meant another handful of Japanese soldiers killed or forced to retreat, each retreat compressing the pocket further and destroying any coherence to the defensive line. American losses continued to accumulate, men killed and wounded as Japanese soldiers fought with the desperate determination of those with no possibility of retreat or surrender. But the mathematical advantage had tipped decisively toward the Americans. Each day brought losses they could absorb and replace. Each day brought losses the Japanese could not possibly replenish. What remained of Japanese command structure recognized the strategic reality.